The Kodiak Research Station Incident. The Kodiak Research Station Incident. Dr. Sarah Chen had always believed that respect and distance were the keys to coexisting with Alaska's apex predators. On May 14, 2025, that belief would be tested in the most horrific way possible when a massive Kodiak bear breached the perimeter of the remote Alutiiq Bay Research Station, turning what should have been a routine day of salmon migration data collection into a nightmare that would leave 9 researchers fighting for their lives and forever change wildlife management protocols across North America. The morning began like any other at the isolated research facility, perched on the rugged coastline of Kodiak Island, 250 miles southwest of Anchorage. The station, operated jointly by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game and the University of Alaska Fairbanks, had been monitoring the island's brown bear populations and salmon runs for over 15 years without a single serious incident. Its location, carefully chosen to minimize human-bear conflicts, sat atop a 30-foot bluff overlooking the pristine waters of Shelikof Strait, connected to the mainland only by a narrow gravel road that wound through dense Sitka spruce forests. Dr. Sarah Chen, the station's lead wildlife biologist, arrived at her office at 6:15 a.m., clutching a steaming mug of coffee as she reviewed the day's research schedule. At 38, Chen had dedicated her career to understanding the complex behavioral patterns of Kodiak brown bears, the largest subspecies of brown bear in the world. Her weathered hands, scarred from years of fieldwork, moved efficiently across her tablet screen as she checked the overnight reports from the automated fish counters positioned along Alutiiq Creek, the salmon-rich waterway that flowed just 200 yards from the main research building. The numbers were promising. After 3 weeks of disappointing salmon counts, the creek was finally showing signs of the spring Chinook run that typically peaked in mid-May. Chen made a mental note to deploy additional research teams to the creek's observation blinds, knowing that increased salmon activity would inevitably draw the island's resident bear population to the area. "Coffee smells good," came a voice from the doorway. Dr. Marcus Webb, the station's marine biologist, leaned against the frame with his characteristic crooked smile. At 42, Webb had been studying Pacific salmon populations for nearly 2 decades, and his partnership with Chen had resulted in groundbreaking research on the intricate relationships between predator and prey populations in the Kodiak archipelago. "There's a fresh pot in the kitchen," Chen replied without looking up from her screen. "Marcus, the Chinook numbers from last night are looking good. We might finally get some decent behavioral observation data today." Webb nodded, understanding the significance. The research team had been waiting weeks for optimal conditions to study bear feeding patterns during the salmon run. Their work was critical for updating wildlife management strategies, particularly given the increasing frequency of human-bear encounters throughout Alaska as development encroached on traditional bear habitat. By 7:30 a.m., the station's full research team had assembled in the main conference room for the daily briefing. The 9-person crew represented some of the most experienced wildlife researchers in Alaska, each bringing specialized expertise to the collaborative effort. Dr. Jennifer Reyes, a behavioral ecologist from Anchorage, sat at the long wooden table reviewing field notes from the previous day's observations. At 35, Reyes had earned recognition for her innovative research on bear communication patterns, using advanced audio recording equipment to document and analyze the subtle vocalizations that bears used to communicate with each other during feeding activities. Next to her sat Dr. Robert Bob Kellerman, a grizzled veteran of Alaskan wildlife management who, at 57, had spent more time in bear country than almost anyone alive. Kellerman's role at the station involved training younger researchers in safety protocols and serving as the team's primary liaison with local Kodiak Island native communities whose traditional knowledge of bear behavior often proved invaluable to the scientific work. Dr. Lisa Park, a 29-year-old graduate student from the University of California, Davis, was completing her doctoral dissertation on the impact of climate change on bear denning patterns. Despite her relative inexperience compared to her colleagues, Park's enthusiasm and fresh perspectives had already contributed to several significant research breakthroughs during her 6-month assignment at the station. The team also included Dr. James Mitchell, a wildlife veterinarian who specialized in emergency field medicine and bear immobilization techniques. Dr. Angela Foster, a GIS specialist who managed the station's sophisticated tracking and mapping systems. Dr. David Kim, a fisheries biologist working on salmon population dynamics. Dr. Maria Santos, an environmental photographer documenting the research for educational outreach programs. And Tom Bradley, a local guide and safety coordinator whose intimate knowledge of Kodiak Island's terrain made him indispensable for planning safe research expeditions. "All right, everyone," Chen began, standing at the head of the table with a detailed map of the research area spread before her. "The overnight counts show significant Chinook activity in the lower creek sections. I want teams positioned at observation blinds 3, 7, and 9 by 9 a.m. The weather forecast looks good. Partly cloudy, winds from the southwest at 5 to 10 knots, high of 52 degrees, perfect conditions for extended observation periods." She pointed to various locations on the map with a red laser pointer, each dot representing carefully positioned observation blinds that allowed researchers to study bear behavior while maintaining safe distances. "Bob, I want you to take Lisa and David to Blind 9. It's been our most productive location this season, and I think Lisa needs more direct observation time for her dissertation data." Kellerman nodded, his weathered face serious. "Weather's been drawing them down to the creek early this year. Had a sow with 2 cubs working the pools just below Blind 9 yesterday evening. She's a big one, probably pushing 600 pounds. Cubs are first year, still nursing, but starting to show interest in the salmon." "Any aggressive behavior?" Webb asked, knowing that sows with cubs represented the highest risk category for human-bear encounters. "Nothing unusual," Kellerman replied. "She's been avoiding the areas where we've had human activity, which is exactly what we want to see. Classic avoidance behavior. But I want everyone to remember that a sow with cubs can go from calm to aggressive in seconds if she perceives a threat." Dr. Reyes looked up from her notes. "I'd like to get audio recordings of any vocalizations between the sow and cubs. My preliminary data suggests that maternal communication patterns change significantly during salmon feeding periods, but I need more samples to establish statistical significance." Chen made notes on her tablet as the team discussed logistics. The station's research protocols had been developed over years of experience and were designed to maximize scientific value while minimizing risk to both researchers and wildlife. Every team carried satellite communication devices, bear spray, and emergency medical supplies. All movements were coordinated through the station's central communication system with mandatory check-ins every 2 hours. "Maria, I want you paired with Jennifer today," Chen continued. "The photographic documentation of feeding behaviors will complement the audio work perfectly. Take the long-range telephoto equipment. I don't want anyone getting closer than 200 yards to active feeding sites." Santos nodded, already mentally planning her shot compositions. Her work at the station had produced some of the most spectacular wildlife photography in recent memory, but she never forgot that her first priority was safety, both for herself and for the animals she documented. "Tom, you'll coordinate safety for all 3 teams," Chen said, turning to the rugged local guide. "I know the terrain has been soft from the recent rains. Are there any access issues I should know about?" Bradley consulted his own hand-drawn map, annotated with pencil marks and symbols that represented years of accumulated knowledge about the island's ever-changing conditions. "The main trail to Blind 9 is solid, but there's been some erosion along the creek bank about halfway down. Nothing dangerous, but teams should stick to the marked path. The alternative route through the spruce grove is still muddy from last week's storm. As the team finalized their plans, none of them could have anticipated that less than 5 miles away, a massive male Kodiak bear was beginning a journey that would bring him into direct conflict with their carefully orchestrated research activities. The bear, estimated later by wildlife officials to weigh over 1,200 pounds, had been driven from his usual territory by a combination of factors that perfectly illustrated the complex challenges facing Alaska's wildlife populations. The bear, designated later as Bear 394 in official reports, had spent the winter in a den located high in the Kodiak Mountains, approximately 8 miles inland from Alutiiq Bay. Like all Kodiak brown bears, he had emerged from hibernation in early April, groggy and hungry after months without food. His normal pattern would have been to work his way gradually toward the coastal areas, feeding on spring vegetation and early returning salmon, before establishing a territory along one of the island's many salmon-rich streams. However, this spring had been different. Unusually warm temperatures in March had caused an early snowmelt, altering the timing of vegetation growth and causing several of the smaller streams in his traditional territory to run lower than normal. More significantly, human activity had increased dramatically in his usual feeding areas due to a combination of commercial fishing operations and recreational camping that had expanded beyond traditional boundaries. The bear had adapted initially, moving to new areas and establishing temporary feeding sites along less familiar waterways. But by early May, increasing pressure from other bears, combined with the scarcity of his preferred food sources, had begun to affect his behavior. Wildlife biologists would later identify this pattern as a classic example of bear displacement, a phenomenon that was becoming increasingly common throughout Alaska as human development and climate change altered traditional wildlife habitats. On the morning of May 14th, Bear 394 had spent several hours feeding on skunk cabbage and other early vegetation in a marshy area approximately 3 miles from the research station. The feeding had been interrupted twice by the sound of aircraft. A commercial fishing helicopter conducting surveys of nearby streams, and a small plane carrying tourists on a bear viewing expedition. Each interruption had increased the bear's stress level and reinforced his association of human presence with disruption of his feeding activities. Around 8:30 a.m., as the research teams were conducting their final equipment checks at the station, Bear 394 caught the scent of salmon from Alutiiq Creek. The rich, oily smell triggered powerful instincts that had been honed over millions of years of evolution. Unlike the smaller streams he had been working, Alutiiq Creek promised abundant, easily accessible protein at a time when the bear desperately needed to rebuild his body condition after the long winter. The bear began moving toward the creek, following scent trails and natural pathways that had been used by his species for countless generations. His route would take him directly through the research station's safety perimeter, but he had no way of understanding the significance of the human structures or the carefully planned research activities that were about to begin. At the station, the research teams were making final preparations for their deployment to the observation blinds. Dr. Chen stood in the equipment room, checking the batteries on the satellite communication devices that would keep the teams connected throughout the day. The devices, rugged units designed for extreme weather conditions, provided both voice communication and GPS tracking capabilities, allowing the station's central command to monitor team locations and respond quickly to any emergencies. "Sarah, we're ready to head out," called Dr. Kellerman from the main corridor. His team, consisting of himself, Dr. Park, and Dr. Kim, had assembled their gear and was prepared for the hike to Observation Blind 9. The blind, located approximately 1.2 miles from the station along a well-maintained trail, offered excellent views of a deep pool where salmon often congregated during their upstream migration. Chen handed Kellerman one of the communication devices and reviewed the day's schedule one final time. Remember, mandatory check-ins every 2 hours. First check at 11 a.m., then 1 p.m., 3 p.m., and final check at 5 p.m. before return. If you don't get a response from base station, activate the emergency beacon immediately. The protocols had been developed through years of experience and input from wildlife management agencies throughout Alaska. Every aspect of the research operation was designed to minimize the possibility of dangerous encounters while maximizing the scientific value of the observations. The communication schedule ensured that no team would be out of contact for more than 2 hours, while the emergency beacons provided a backup communication method that could summon rescue services even in the most remote locations. Dr. Park shouldered her backpack, heavy with data recording equipment and sample collection materials. Despite having spent 6 months at the station, she still felt a thrill of excitement when heading into the field. Her doctoral research on climate change impacts required extensive data collection, and every day in the field brought new insights into the complex relationships between environmental conditions and bear behavior. Lisa, make sure you're getting GPS coordinates for every behavioral observation, Dr. Kim reminded her as they prepared to leave. The salmon population data I'm collecting will be much more valuable if we can correlate it with precise locations of bear feeding activities. The collaboration between different research specialties was one of the station's greatest strengths. By combining expertise in wildlife biology, fisheries science, and environmental monitoring, the team was able to develop comprehensive understanding of the ecosystem dynamics that drove both salmon runs and bear populations. As Kellerman's team prepared to depart, Dr. Reyes and Maria Santos were finalizing their own equipment setup for the day's audio and photographic work. Reyes's specialized recording equipment included highly sensitive directional microphones capable of capturing bear vocalizations at distances of over 300 yards, while Santos's camera gear featured telephoto lenses that could document detailed behaviors without disturbing the animals. The light conditions should be perfect for photography today, Santos observed, checking her camera settings. The partly cloudy conditions will provide even lighting without harsh shadows. If we get good behavioral sequences, these shots could be featured in the educational materials we're developing for the park service. Dr. Webb and Dr. Foster were preparing to establish a temporary data collection station along the creek, where they would monitor water conditions and salmon activity in real time. Their work provided crucial environmental context for the behavioral observations being conducted by the other teams. At 9:15 a.m., all 3 research teams departed the station on schedule, following well-marked trails that led through the coastal forest toward their designated observation sites. The morning air was crisp and clear, with the temperature holding steady at 48 degrees Fahrenheit. A light breeze from the southwest carried the scent of sea spray and fresh vegetation, along with the subtle but distinctive smell of salmon that indicated the fish were present in good numbers. None of the researchers were aware that Bear 394 had already crossed the station's outer safety perimeter and was moving steadily toward Alutiiq Creek along a game trail that would bring him within 50 yards of observation blind 9. The bear's movement was purposeful and direct, driven by hunger and the increasingly strong scent of salmon that drew him toward what would soon become a collision point between human scientific activity and wild predator behavior. Dr. Kellerman's team reached observation blind 9 at 9:45 a.m., exactly on schedule. The blind, constructed of weathered cedar logs and designed to blend seamlessly with the surrounding forest, provided an excellent vantage point, overlooking a series of deep pools where Chinook salmon gathered during their upstream migration. The structure included bench seating for 3 researchers, storage compartments for equipment, and carefully positioned observation ports that allowed for photography and data collection while keeping human scent and movement to a minimum. "Perfect timing, Doctor," Park whispered as she set up her data recording equipment. Below them, the creek was alive with salmon activity. Dozens of large Chinook, their sides flashing silver in the dappled sunlight, moved through the clear water with the determined urgency that characterized their spawning migration. Dr. Kim began documenting the fish populations using a standardized counting protocol that would allow for accurate population estimates. His work required careful observation and precise record keeping, as the data would be used by fisheries managers to make critical decisions about commercial and subsistence fishing quotas. "I count at least 40 Chinook in the main pool," Kim reported quietly, making notes on his waterproof data sheets. "Average size appears to be above normal for this time of season. This is looking like it could be an excellent run." Kellerman surveyed the surrounding forest with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades in bear country. Everything appeared normal. The natural sounds of the forest continued undisturbed, and there were no obvious signs of bear activity in the immediate area. However, his years of experience had taught him that conditions could change rapidly, and constant vigilance was essential for safe research operations. At approximately 10:15 a.m., Kellerman noticed the first subtle sign that something was different. The Steller's jays that had been calling from the trees above the blind suddenly fell silent, their absence creating an unnatural quiet that experienced woodsmen learned to recognize as a potential warning signal. "Hold up," Kellerman said quietly, raising his hand to pause the data collection activities. He listened intently, his senses tuned to detect any anomaly in the forest's natural rhythm. After 30 seconds of silence, he relaxed slightly. "Probably just a hawk or eagle passing through, but let's stay alert." Dr. Park, focused intensely on her data collection, barely acknowledged the interruption. Her recording equipment was capturing detailed measurements of water temperature, flow rate, and other environmental variables that would be critical for understanding how climate change was affecting salmon migration patterns. The work required precise timing and careful attention to equipment calibration. What none of the researchers realized was that Bear 394 was now less than 200 yards away, moving slowly through the dense Sitka spruce forest that bordered the creek. The bear had been attracted by the intense scent of salmon, but he was also detecting something else, the unfamiliar smell of humans and their equipment. His approach had become more cautious as the human scent grew stronger, but his hunger and determination to reach the salmon were overriding his natural tendency to avoid human contact. The bear's behavior at this point would later be analyzed extensively by wildlife experts attempting to understand the sequence of events that led to the attack. Unlike many bear encounters which result from surprise meetings on trails or around blind corners, Bear 394's approach was deliberate and calculated. He was aware of human presence, but had made a conscious decision to continue toward the salmon-rich waters despite that awareness. At 10:32 a.m., Dr. Reyes's audio recording equipment, positioned approximately 150 yards downstream from Blind 9, detected the first sounds of the approaching bear. The sensitive microphones picked up the subtle sounds of breaking branches and disturbed vegetation that indicated a large animal moving through the forest. However, Reyes, who was focused on adjusting her equipment settings, initially dismissed the sounds as normal forest activity. "Jenny, are you getting anything interesting on the audio?" Santos asked through the radio, her voice barely above a whisper to avoid disturbing any wildlife in the area. "Some movement sounds from upstream," Reyes replied. Could be a bear approaching the creek, but it's hard to tell from this distance. The acoustics are tricky with all the background noise from the water. Santos adjusted her telephoto lens and began scanning the forest edge near the creek, hoping to capture images of any bears that might emerge to feed on the salmon. Her camera was equipped with a 600mm lens that could provide detailed shots from a safe distance, and she was prepared to document whatever wildlife activity might develop. At observation blind 9, Dr. Kellerman was becoming increasingly uneasy. The forest's silence had deepened, and even the salmon in the creek below seemed to be behaving differently. Instead of the steady, purposeful movement that characterized normal feeding behavior, the fish appeared nervous and scattered, frequently changing direction as if responding to some disturbance upstream. "Something's got the fish spooked," Kim observed, noting the changed behavior in his data logs. This kind of erratic movement usually indicates predator presence. Kellerman made a decision that would later be credited with preventing an even more catastrophic outcome. "Pack it up," he said quietly but firmly. "We're moving back to the secondary observation point. Something doesn't feel right here." The secondary observation point, located approximately 300 yards upstream from Blind 9, offered a less optimal view of salmon feeding behavior, but provided better escape routes and more open sightlines. Kellerman's decision to relocate was based entirely on instinct, but it demonstrated the kind of experienced judgment that was essential for safe operations in bear country. As the three researchers began quickly but quietly gathering their equipment, Bear 394 emerged from the forest directly across the creek from their position. The massive animal appeared suddenly at the water's edge, his enormous bulk immediately dominating the landscape. Even from a distance of nearly 100 yards, the bear's size was shocking. He stood nearly 4 feet tall at the shoulder while on all fours, and his massive head and powerful build identified him immediately as a mature male Kodiak brown bear. "Jesus Christ," Dr. Park whispered, her voice barely audible as she stared at the enormous predator. Despite months of studying bear behavior, she had never seen an animal of such impressive size in the wild. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her camera, instinctively documenting the encounter, even as her training told her to prepare for immediate evacuation. Kellerman's reaction was immediate and decisive. "Nobody move," he said in a voice that was calm but carried absolute authority. "Jenny, can you hear me on the radio? We have a large male bear at the creek, approximately 100 yards from our position. We're going to need support for extraction." Dr. Reyes's voice came back through the radio immediately. "Copy that, Bob. I can see him through the telephoto lens. He's huge. What's your plan?" "We're going to wait for him to move downstream, then evacuate to the secondary position. Do not, under any circumstances, approach this area. Maria, are you getting this?" Santos's response was immediate. "I'm getting photos. This is incredible, Bob. He's got to be 1,200 pounds or more. I've never seen a bear this size." For several minutes, Bear 394 remained at the creek's edge, surveying the area and apparently assessing the salmon activity in the pools below. His behavior was methodical and purposeful, showing none of the anxiety or agitation that might indicate an imminent charge. However, Kellerman knew that bear behavior could change instantly, and he was prepared to implement emergency protocols at the first sign of aggression. The bear waded into the creek, his massive paws creating significant disturbance in the water as he began fishing. His technique was impressive, demonstrating the skill that had allowed him to reach such an enormous size. Within minutes, he had successfully caught 2 large Chinook salmon, consuming them with the efficient brutality that characterized apex predator feeding behavior. "This is incredible behavioral data," Dr. Park whispered, her scientific training overriding her fear as she observed the bear's fishing techniques. "The efficiency of his hunting is remarkable. I need to document this sequence." "Document from a distance," Kellerman replied firmly. We maintain our current position until he moves on. No exceptions. For nearly 20 minutes, the researchers observed the bear's feeding behavior from their position in blind 9. The animal showed no awareness of human presence and appeared completely focused on taking advantage of the salmon concentration. His feeding was methodical and efficient, catching and consuming fish with practiced skill. However, at approximately 11:05 a.m., the situation began to change. Bear 394 had consumed several salmon and was beginning to move along the creek bank, investigating different pools and feeding areas. His movement pattern brought him steadily closer to observation blind 9, reducing the distance between the researchers and the massive predator. "He's working his way upstream," Kellerman reported through the radio. "We need to evacuate now, before he gets any closer." The evacuation plan that had been rehearsed countless times was put into action. Dr. Park and Dr. Kim began packing essential equipment, while Kellerman maintained visual contact with the bear and coordinated their movements. The goal was to move quickly but quietly away from the blind and toward the secondary observation point, where they would have better escape routes if the situation deteriorated. However, as the researchers began their carefully planned withdrawal, Bear 394's behavior changed dramatically. The massive animal suddenly stopped feeding and raised his head, his sensitive nose testing the air currents. The wind had shifted slightly, carrying human scent directly toward the bear for the first time since his arrival at the creek. The bear's reaction was immediate and alarming. Instead of the defensive withdrawal that researchers expected from most bears upon detecting human presence, Bear 394 turned directly toward the source of the scent and began moving purposefully in the direction of observation blind 9. "He's coming this way," Kellerman said into his radio, his voice remaining calm despite the obvious danger of the situation. "All teams, we have a potentially aggressive bear approaching our position. Implement emergency protocols immediately." Dr. Chen's voice came through the radio from the base station with crisp authority. "Bob, what's your exact position and status? Do you need immediate evacuation support?" "We're approximately 50 yards north of blind 9, moving toward the secondary position. Bear is following our scent trail and closing distance. Estimate he'll reach our last position in less than 2 minutes." The next few minutes would be critical. Kellerman's team was following established protocols for bear encounters, moving steadily away from the animal while avoiding sudden movements that might trigger a charge. However, Bear 394's behavior was becoming increasingly concerning as he continued to follow their scent trail rather than returning to his feeding activities. "Sarah, we need the helicopter on standby," Kellerman continued, referring to the emergency evacuation helicopter that was kept on call during all field research operations. "This bear is not showing normal avoidance behavior. Something's wrong with his response patterns." Dr. Chen was already activating the emergency response protocols that had been developed for exactly this type of situation. The station maintained contracts with local aviation services for emergency evacuation, and she was placing the first of several calls that would bring professional help to the area within minutes. However, the situation was developing faster than anyone had anticipated. Bear 394 had reached the observation blind and was investigating the structure with obvious interest. His behavior suggested that he was not simply passing through the area, but was actively investigating the human presence that he had detected. "He's at the blind," Dr. Park reported, her voice tight with tension as she watched the enormous animal through binoculars. He's investigating our equipment. This isn't normal behavior, is it?" Kellerman's response was grim. "No, it's not. Normal bears avoid human scent. This one is actively investigating it. We need to increase distance immediately." The three researchers continued their withdrawal toward the secondary observation point, but Bear 394's behavior was becoming increasingly problematic. Instead of losing interest in the human scent and returning to his fishing, the bear had begun following their trail with what appeared to be deliberate intent. Wildlife experts would later classify Bear 394's behavior as predatory stalking, a rare but extremely dangerous behavior pattern in which bears begin to view humans as potential prey rather than as threats to be avoided. The behavior was most commonly observed in bears who had lost their natural fear of humans through food conditioning or territorial displacement, but it could also occur in bears under extreme stress or those defending critical food resources. At 11:18 a.m., the situation escalated beyond anyone's worst-case scenarios. Bear 394, who had been following the researchers' scent trail at a steady walking pace, suddenly broke into a fast trot that rapidly accelerated into a full charge. The massive animal covered the 150-yard distance between his position and the fleeing researchers in less than 30 seconds, his powerful limbs propelling his enormous bulk at speeds that seemed impossible for such a large animal. "He's charging!" Kellerman shouted into his radio as he pushed Dr. Park ahead of him toward the nearest large tree. "All teams, we have an active bear attack in progress. Emergency evacuation required immediately." Dr. Kim, who was carrying the team's bear spray, managed to deploy the defensive deterrent as Bear 394 closed the final distance between them. The orange cloud of concentrated capsaicin created a brief barrier between the bear and the researchers, but the massive animal burst through the spray with barely a pause in his charge. The impact when Bear 394 reached the researchers was devastating. The bear struck Dr. Kim first, his massive paw connecting with the fisheries biologist's chest and launching him nearly 10 feet backward into the base of a large Sitka spruce. The sound of the impact, a combination of the bear's roar and Kim's scream of pain, would haunt the other researchers for the rest of their lives. Dr. Park, who had been climbing toward the lower branches of an adjacent tree, was caught by the bear's second swipe. The animal's claws, each nearly 4 inches long and honed to razor sharpness, raked across her left leg and hip, opening deep gashes that began bleeding profusely. She fell from her precarious position on the tree trunk and landed heavily on the forest floor, her leg twisted at an unnatural angle. Kellerman, drawing on decades of experience in dangerous situations, managed to avoid the bear's initial attacks by putting a large tree between himself and the animal. However, Bear 394's rage was focused and sustained, unlike the brief defensive attacks that characterized most bear encounters. The animal continued his assault with methodical determination, alternating between the two downed researchers and preventing Kellerman from reaching them with aid. "Base station! We have multiple casualties!" Kellerman screamed into his radio while maneuvering to keep the tree between himself and the attacking bear. "Kim is down and unresponsive. Lisa has severe leg injuries. We need immediate medical evacuation." Dr. Chen's voice came back through the radio with the calm authority that was essential in emergency situations. "Bob, help is on the way. Helicopter ETA is 12 minutes. Can you maintain your position until then?" The question would have seemed absurd under normal circumstances, but in the midst of a bear attack, every second of survival was a victory. Kellerman assessed his situation quickly. He was uninjured and had access to the emergency flare gun that all teams carried for exactly this type of situation. However, using the flares risked starting a forest fire in the dry conditions, and he was not certain they would be effective in deterring such a large and determined bear. Bear 394's attack continued with horrifying persistence. The massive animal alternated between mauling Dr. Kim, who lay motionless against the base of the spruce tree, and Dr. Park, who was conscious but unable to move due to her leg injuries. The bear's behavior was unlike anything in the scientific literature. Rather than making a brief defensive attack and withdrawing, he appeared to be systematically attempting to kill or disable all 3 humans. "Lisa, can you hear me?" Kellerman called to Dr. Park while maintaining his position behind the protective tree. "You need to stay as still as possible. Don't make any sounds that might attract his attention." Dr. Park's response was weak but coherent. "Bob, I think my leg is broken. I can't feel my foot. David, is David alive?" Kellerman could see Dr. Kim's motionless form approximately 20 yards away, but the continued presence of Bear 394 made it impossible to reach him or assess his condition. The bear was moving between the two injured researchers with methodical precision, occasionally returning his attention to Kellerman's hiding place, as if aware that a third human remained in the area. The radio crackled with Dr. Chen's voice. "Bob, I have Dr. Reyes and Maria evacuating toward the base station. They're safe. Helicopter is 8 minutes out. How are Kim and Park?" "Kim is unconscious. Possible head trauma. Park has severe leg injuries, but is conscious. The bear is not withdrawing, Sarah. This is not normal defensive behavior. He's actively hunting us." The distinction was critical from both a survival and a scientific perspective. Defensive bear attacks, which comprise the vast majority of human-bear encounters, typically lasted only a few seconds as the animal neutralized the perceived threat and then withdrew. Predatory attacks, which were extremely rare but far more dangerous, could continue for extended periods as the bear attempted to kill and consume its prey. Bear 394's sustained assault suggested that he had categorized the researchers as prey rather than as threats, a behavioral shift that made the situation exponentially more dangerous. Predatory bear attacks required different survival strategies than defensive encounters, and Kellerman was drawing on every bit of his extensive experience to keep himself and his injured colleagues alive until help could arrive. At 11:25 a.m., the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors began echoing off the surrounding mountains as the emergency evacuation aircraft approached the research area. The helicopter, a Bell 407 operated by Alaska Emergency Services, was equipped with medical personnel and specialized equipment for wilderness rescue operations. However, the thick forest canopy and the presence of an aggressive bear made immediate landing and rescue impossible. "Base station, this is Medivac 7, came the helicopter pilot's voice over the radio frequencies. "We have visual on your location, but cannot attempt landing with the bear still active. We need the animal cleared from the immediate area before we can deploy rescue personnel." The helicopter's arrival had an unexpected effect on Bear 394's behavior. The loud noise of the rotors and the vibration of the aircraft overhead caused the massive animal to become even more agitated and aggressive. Instead of withdrawing from the area, as most bears would when confronted with such an obvious human presence, Bear 394 seemed to interpret the helicopter as an additional threat to his dominance of the territory. The bear's renewed aggression focused on Dr. Park, who had been attempting to crawl toward better cover while the animal was distracted by the helicopter. Bear 394 caught her movement and charged, his massive jaws clamping down on her right arm and shaking her with the kind of violent motion that grizzly bears use to break the necks of large prey animals. Dr. Park's screams of pain and terror carried clearly over the sound of the helicopter rotors, and Kellerman made the decision that would later be credited with saving both of his colleagues' lives. Abandoning the safety of his position behind the tree, he activated one of the emergency flares and charged toward the bear, screaming at the top of his lungs and waving the burning flare in an attempt to drive the animal away from Dr. Park. The combination of the flare's bright light, acrid smoke, and Kellerman's aggressive approach had the desired effect. Bear 394 released Dr. Park and turned to face this new threat, his massive head lowered and his ears laid back in the unmistakable posture of an animal preparing to attack. "Come on, you bastard!" Kellerman shouted, continuing to wave the flare while backing slowly toward a cluster of large boulders that might provide some protection. "Come after me! Leave them alone!" The confrontation between the experienced wildlife manager and the enormous bear lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity to everyone involved. Bear 394 made several false charges toward Kellerman, each time stopping just short of actual contact as if evaluating this new threat. The flare's smoke and flame seemed to confuse the animal, disrupting his attack patterns and giving the injured researchers precious time to move toward better positions. However, the standoff could not continue indefinitely. The flare was burning rapidly, and once it was exhausted, Kellerman would be left with no effective deterrent against the massive predator. The helicopter continued circling overhead, its crew desperately seeking some way to assist the ground personnel without making the situation worse. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Reyes and Maria Santos, who had been evacuating toward the base station as instructed, had heard the sounds of the attack and made the decision to violate safety protocols in order to help their colleagues. Working together, they had retrieved the station's emergency noisemakers, a combination of air horns and explosive charges used to scare bears away from research facilities. "Bob, we're coming in from the south with noise deterrents," Dr. Reyes reported over the radio. "Keep the bear focused on your position for 30 more seconds." The coordinated noise attack began at 11:31 a.m. and lasted for nearly 2 minutes. Dr. Reyes and Santos deployed air horns, explosive charges, and even pots and pans in a cacophony of sound designed to overwhelm Bear 394's senses and convince him that the area was under assault by a large group of humans. The tactic, known as hazing, was commonly used by wildlife managers to drive problem bears away from populated areas. The effect on Bear 394 was dramatic and immediate. The massive animal, confronted simultaneously by the helicopter overhead, Kellerman's flare, and the approaching wall of sound, finally exhibited the withdrawal behavior that the researchers had been hoping to see from the beginning. With a final threatening roar in Kellerman's direction, the bear turned and crashed into the forest, his enormous bulk disappearing into the dense Sitka spruce with surprising speed. "Bear is withdrawing to the northwest," Kellerman reported breathlessly into his radio. "All personnel are accounted for. We have 2 serious casualties requiring immediate medical evacuation." The helicopter was able to land in a small clearing, approximately 100 yards from the attack site, within 3 minutes of the bear's departure. The medical crew, consisting of 2 paramedics and a flight nurse, immediately began assessing and treating Dr. Kim and Dr. Park, while Kellerman and the other researchers maintained watch for the bear's possible return. Dr. Kim's injuries were the more severe of the 2. The bear's initial blow had broken several ribs and caused significant internal injuries, including a ruptured spleen that was causing dangerous internal bleeding. He had also suffered a severe concussion when his head struck the tree, leaving him unconscious and unresponsive throughout most of the attack. "We need to get him to Anchorage immediately," the flight nurse reported after completing her initial assessment. "He has internal bleeding that requires surgical intervention within the hour. This is beyond the capabilities of the Kodiak medical facilities." Dr. Park's injuries were gruesome but less immediately life-threatening. The bear's claws had opened deep gashes along her left leg and hip, requiring immediate suturing to control bleeding. Her right arm, where the bear's jaws had clamped down during the final stages of the attack, showed severe tissue damage and possible bone fractures, but the bleeding had been controlled through direct pressure and pressure bandages. "Lisa, you're gonna be okay," the flight nurse assured her as the medical team prepared her for transport. "We're going to get you to the hospital where they can properly assess and treat your injuries. You're incredibly lucky that Dr. Kellerman was able to distract the bear when he did." The helicopter evacuation of the 2 most seriously injured researchers was completed by 11:52 a.m., less than an hour after Bear 394 had first emerged from the forest. However, the incident was far from over. Wildlife management agencies throughout Alaska were already mobilizing resources to locate and assess the bear, while emergency medical personnel at Providence Alaska Medical Center in Anchorage were preparing for the arrival of 2 patients with severe trauma injuries. Dr. Chen, who had been coordinating the emergency response from the base station, now faced the complex task of managing the aftermath of the most serious incident in the research station's 15-year history. Her first priority was ensuring the safety of the remaining research personnel, but she also had to begin the extensive documentation and reporting process that would be required by multiple state and federal agencies. "Tom, I need you to coordinate with Fish and Game for a complete site assessment," she instructed Bradley, the station's safety coordinator. "This bear's behavior was completely outside normal parameters. We need to understand what triggered the predatory response and assess the risk for future encounters." But the Alaska Department of Fish and Game's response was immediate and comprehensive. Within 2 hours of the attack, a team of wildlife experts was en route to Kodiak Island with specialized equipment for tracking and, if necessary, destroying the bear responsible for the attack. The decision to potentially kill Bear 394 was not made lightly, but predatory behavior toward humans represented an unacceptable risk to public safety. Dr. Janet Morrison, the state's lead bear biologist, arrived at the research station at 3:45 p.m. aboard a chartered helicopter carrying a full investigative team. Morrison had been studying Alaska's brown bear populations for over 20 years and had investigated dozens of bear attacks throughout the state. However, the circumstances of the Alutiiq Bay incident were unlike anything in her experience. "The sustained nature of this attack is extremely unusual," Morrison explained to Dr. Chen as they reviewed the preliminary incident reports. "Most bear attacks last less than 2 minutes. This one continued for over 30 minutes, with the bear actively pursuing and attempting to kill multiple victims. That behavior pattern suggests either rabies or some other form of neurological impairment. The possibility that Bear 394 might be rabid added a new dimension of urgency to the search efforts. Rabies in bears was extremely rare in Alaska, but it had been documented in other parts of North America and represented a significant public health threat, if confirmed. All personnel who had been exposed to the bear's saliva or blood would require immediate post-exposure prophylaxis, and the entire area would need to be quarantined until the animal could be located and tested. However, the search for Bear 394 proved to be more challenging than anyone had anticipated. Despite the deployment of tracking dogs, aircraft, and experienced hunters, the massive bear seemed to have vanished into the vast wilderness of Kodiak Island. His tracks were followed for nearly 3 miles before disappearing into a rocky area where tracking became impossible. "Bears don't just disappear," Morrison told the search team leaders as they reviewed the day's unsuccessful tracking efforts. "An animal this size leaves sign wherever he goes. Either he's moved much farther than we anticipated, or he's holed up in terrain that's hiding his presence." The search for Bear 394 would continue for the next 5 days, involving over 40 personnel from multiple agencies and costing an estimated $200,000 in helicopter time, personnel costs, and equipment deployment. The bear was finally located on May 19th by a commercial fishing pilot who spotted the distinctive massive form along a remote creek approximately 15 miles southeast of the attack site. The decision to destroy Bear 394 was made after extensive consultation with wildlife management experts, tribal representatives, and public safety officials. While the death of any bear was regrettable, the animal's predatory behavior toward humans represented a clear and ongoing threat that could not be managed through relocation or other non-lethal methods. Dr. Morrison personally conducted the necropsy of Bear 394 on May 20th, with tissue samples sent to laboratories in Anchorage and the lower 48 for comprehensive analysis. The examination revealed several significant findings that helped explain the bear's unusual behavior during the attack. The bear was indeed enormous, weighing 1,247 pounds and measuring over 9 feet from nose to tail. He was estimated to be approximately 12 years old, placing him in the prime of his life for a male Kodiak brown bear. However, the necropsy also revealed evidence of chronic stress and malnutrition that suggested the bear had been struggling to find adequate food sources in the weeks leading up to the attack. His stomach contents showed almost no food for the previous 24 to 48 hours, Morrison explained in her preliminary report. For a bear this size to be essentially fasting during the peak salmon season suggests significant disruption of his normal feeding patterns. That level of hunger, combined with territorial displacement, could explain the aggressive behavior toward humans. The laboratory analysis ruled out rabies and other infectious diseases, but did reveal elevated stress hormone levels that were consistent with an animal under extreme environmental pressure. The findings supported the theory that Bear 394's attack had been triggered by a combination of hunger, territorial displacement, and the bear's association of humans with disruption of his feeding activities. Meanwhile, at Providence, Alaska Medical Center in Anchorage, Dr. Kim and Dr. Park were beginning their long journey toward recovery from the traumatic injuries they had suffered during the attack. Dr. Kim's condition had been touch and go during the first 48 hours after his arrival, requiring emergency surgery to repair his ruptured spleen and address the internal bleeding that had threatened his life. "David's lucky to be alive," Dr. Patricia Winters, the trauma surgeon who had performed the emergency surgery, explained to his family. "The force of that bear's blow was equivalent to being hit by a small car. He has multiple rib fractures, the spleen injury we repaired, and a severe concussion that we're monitoring closely. But all of his vital signs are stable, and we expect him to make a full recovery." Dr. Park's injuries, while not immediately life-threatening, required multiple surgical procedures to repair the extensive tissue damage caused by the bear's claws and teeth. The reconstructive surgery on her right arm alone required over 6 hours, and the expertise of specialized hand surgeons to restore function to the damaged muscles and tendons. "Lisa is looking at several months of physical therapy and rehabilitation," explained Dr. Michael Chen, the orthopedic surgeon overseeing her care. "The bear's claws caused significant damage to the muscle groups in her leg and arm, but we've been able to repair most of the structures. With dedicated rehabilitation, she should regain close to full function in both limbs." The psychological trauma of the attack proved to be as challenging as the physical injuries for both survivors. Dr. Kim, upon regaining consciousness 3 days after the attack, experienced severe anxiety attacks whenever he heard loud noises or sudden sounds. Dr. Park reported vivid nightmares and flashbacks that made sleep difficult and interfered with her physical recovery. What these individuals experienced was far beyond what most people can imagine, explained Dr. Sarah Johnson, the clinical psychologist assigned to work with the attack survivors. They faced their own mortality in the most primal way possible, being hunted by one of nature's ultimate predators. The psychological recovery from that kind of trauma can take years and requires specialized treatment approaches. The impact of the attack extended far beyond the immediate victims. Dr. Chen and the entire research team struggled with guilt and second-guessing about whether different decisions could have prevented the incident. The research station's operations were suspended indefinitely, while safety protocols were reviewed and updated based on lessons learned from the attack. "We followed all the established protocols," Dr. Chen told the investigative panel reviewing the incident. "We had communication schedules, emergency equipment, experienced personnel, and backup support systems. But none of that was designed to deal with a bear exhibiting predatory behavior. We need to completely rethink our approach to safety in bear country. The incident also triggered a comprehensive review of wildlife management policies throughout Alaska. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game, working with federal agencies and university researchers, began developing new protocols for assessing bear behavior and identifying animals that might pose increased risks to human safety. This attack has taught us that we can't rely on traditional assumptions about bear behavior, explained Commissioner James Roberts of the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. Climate change, habitat displacement, and increasing human presence in wild areas are creating new challenges that require adaptive management approaches. We need to stay ahead of these changes if we want to prevent future tragedies. The media coverage of the Kodiak Research Station attack was extensive, with news outlets throughout North America and internationally covering the story. The dramatic nature of the incident, combined with the compelling backstories of the researchers involved, made it a natural fit for both traditional news coverage and documentary treatment. Bear Attack Survivors Tell Their Story became a best-selling book co-authored by Dr. Kim and Dr. Park 6 months after the attack. The book provided detailed first-person accounts of the incident and became an important resource for wilderness safety education programs throughout North America. The Discovery Channel produced a feature-length documentary about the attack, titled When Bears Hunt Humans, which aired 18 months after the incident. The documentary used dramatic recreations, expert interviews, and actual audio recordings from the attack to tell the complete story of the incident and its aftermath. However, the most lasting impact of the Kodiak Research Station attack was on wildlife management and wilderness safety protocols throughout North America. The incident became a case study taught in wildlife management programs, emergency response training courses, and wilderness education seminars from Alaska to Yellowstone. New safety protocols developed in response to the attack included enhanced communication systems, mandatory emergency beacon deployment, revised team size requirements, and specialized training for identifying and responding to predatory bear behavior. These protocols were adopted by research institutions, government agencies, and outdoor recreation organizations throughout bear habitat regions. Dr. Kellerman, whose quick thinking and heroic actions had saved the lives of his colleagues, became a sought-after speaker at wilderness safety conferences and training seminars. His presentation, Recognizing and Surviving Predatory Bear Encounters, became standard training material for personnel working in bear country throughout North America. The most important lesson from Kodiak is that bears are individuals, not just members of a species, Kellerman explained in his presentations. Each bear has its own personality, stress levels, and behavioral patterns. When those patterns are disrupted by environmental pressures, the results can be completely outside our normal expectations. We have to stay alert to those possibilities and be prepared to adapt our responses accordingly. 1 year after the attack, Dr. Kim returned to fieldwork, though not in bear country. His experience at Kodiak had convinced him to shift his research focus to marine environments, where the risks were more manageable and predictable. He continued his work on salmon populations, but conducted his studies from boats and coastal facilities rather than in the remote wilderness areas where bears posed constant threats. Dr. Park's recovery took longer, both physically and psychologically. She required 3 additional surgeries to restore full function to her injured arm and spent over 8 months in physical therapy rebuilding the strength and coordination that had been compromised by the bear's attack. However, she eventually returned to her doctoral research, completing her dissertation on climate change impacts and earning her PhD with highest honors. The attack changed my perspective on research priorities, Dr. Park explained in an interview 2 years after the incident. I realized that the data we were collecting was important, but not worth risking human lives. My current research focuses on developing remote sensing technologies that can gather the same information without requiring researchers to work in dangerous proximity to large predators. Dr. Chen continued as director of the Alutiiq Bay Research Station, but the facility's operations were significantly modified in response to the attack. The station now maintains a much larger safety perimeter around its facilities, uses helicopter-deployed remote sensors for most data collection, and requires all field personnel to work in teams of at least 4 people with mandatory armed escorts. We learned that respect for wildlife doesn't mean we can predict or control their behavior, Chen reflected. Bears are wild animals operating according to their own survival instincts. When those instincts are disrupted by environmental pressures, human presence can trigger responses that are completely outside normal behavioral patterns. Our job is to develop research methods that acknowledge that reality while still gathering the scientific data needed for effective wildlife management. The Kodiak Research Station attack also influenced legal and regulatory frameworks governing wildlife research throughout North America. New federal regulations required enhanced safety protocols, mandatory insurance coverage for personnel working in predator habitat, and specialized training requirements for supervisory personnel. The incident highlighted the complex ethical questions surrounding wildlife research in an era of climate change and increasing human-wildlife conflicts. As traditional habitats became less reliable, and wild animals were forced to adapt to rapidly changing environmental conditions, the risks associated with close proximity research increased dramatically. We're operating in a new paradigm where the old rules don't necessarily apply, explained Dr. Janet Morrison, whose investigation of the Kodiak attack had led to her appointment as Alaska's Deputy Commissioner for Wildlife Management. Climate change is disrupting behavioral patterns that have been stable for thousands of years. Bears, wolves, and other large predators are being forced to adapt to new conditions, and that adaptation process can produce unpredictable and potentially dangerous behaviors. The long-term monitoring of Bear 394's territory revealed additional insights into the factors that had contributed to his aggressive behavior. Fish and game personnel documented significant changes in salmon run timing, vegetation growth patterns, and human activity levels that had combined to create unprecedented stress on the local bear population. What happened at Kodiak wasn't an isolated incident, Morrison explained. It was the result of multiple environmental stresses converging in ways that we're only beginning to understand. As those stresses become more common throughout Alaska, we can expect to see more bears exhibiting non-traditional behaviors. Our management strategies need to evolve accordingly. 3 years after the attack, a memorial was established at the Alutiiq Bay Research Station, honoring both the survivors of the incident and Bear 394 himself. The memorial, a simple stone cairn overlooking the creek where the attack occurred, bore a plaque with words chosen by Dr. Kim and Dr. Park. In memory of the complex relationship between humans and wildlife, may we learn to coexist with wisdom, respect, and humility in the face of forces beyond our control. The Kodiak Research Station attack of May 14, 2025, remains one of the most thoroughly documented and analyzed wildlife encounters in North American history. The incident serves as a sobering reminder of the risks inherent in wildlife research and the unpredictable nature of large predator behavior under environmental stress. More importantly, the attack and its aftermath have contributed to significant improvements in wilderness safety protocols, wildlife management strategies, and our understanding of how climate change is affecting predator behavior throughout the Arctic and subarctic regions. The lessons learned from that terrifying day continue to inform policies and procedures that protect both researchers and wildlife throughout bear country. The survivors of the attack have all returned to productive careers in wildlife research and management, though their experiences at Kodiak have fundamentally shaped their approaches to their work. Their continued contributions to conservation science serve as testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of learning from even the most traumatic experiences. As Dr. Kellerman observed in his final report on the incident, "We went to Kodiak to study bears, but ended up learning more about ourselves, our limitations, our courage, and our capacity to survive and adapt when faced with nature's ultimate test. That knowledge makes us better researchers, better managers, and better guardians of the wild places and wild creatures that define Alaska's natural heritage." The attack at Alutiiq Bay Research Station will continue to be studied and remembered as long as humans work in bear country. Its lessons have already saved lives and will continue to do so for generations of researchers, managers, and outdoor enthusiasts who venture into the wilderness where humans and large predators must somehow find ways to coexist. In the end, the incident serves as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration, a reminder of nature's power and unpredictability, but also a testament to human courage, quick thinking, and the bonds of loyalty that connect people who share the risks and rewards of working to understand and protect our planet's most magnificent wild creatures and wild places. The next stories. The Shadows of Granite Peak. The Shadows of Granite Peak. The morning mist clung to the pine-covered slopes of the Cascade Mountains like a shroud, and Dr. Sarah Chen should have taken that as an omen. Instead, she adjusted her backpack straps and breathed in the crisp mountain air, feeling the familiar thrill of another research expedition beginning. As a wildlife biologist specializing in predator behavior, she had spent 15 years studying apex predators across North America. But something about this particular assignment felt different. "You sure about this weather window?" asked Marcus Whitfield, her longtime field partner and photographer, squinting up at the grey clouds gathering around Granite Peak's summit. At 38, Marcus had documented wildlife in some of the world's most remote locations, but even his weathered face showed concern as he studied the darkening sky. Sarah consulted her GPS unit and weather radio. "Storm's not supposed to hit until Thursday. We'll be back down by Wednesday afternoon." She tried to sound more confident than she felt. The past week's unusual animal behavior reports from the local ranger station had been troubling. Livestock found partially consumed but abandoned, strange tracks near remote cabins, and an eerie silence in areas that should have been teeming with small game. Their guide, Tom Redhawk, emerged from his pickup truck carrying the last of their supplies. A member of the local Salish Kootenai tribe and veteran wilderness guide, Tom had agreed to lead them into the backcountry only after significant hesitation. "My grandfather used to tell stories about this part of the mountains," he had said during their planning meeting. "Said there were places where the natural order got twisted, places where predators didn't behave like they should." Sarah had dismissed such talk as folklore, but now, standing at the trailhead with the ancient peaks looming above them, she found herself remembering Tom's words with uncomfortable clarity. The fourth member of their party was Jake Morrison, a graduate student in wildlife ecology whose eagerness to prove himself sometimes outweighed his common sense. At 26, Jake possessed impressive book knowledge but limited field experience, and Sarah had reluctantly agreed to bring him along, primarily as a favor to his advisor at the university. "The elevation here is approximately 4,200 feet, Jake announced, consulting his altimeter with the precision of someone trying too hard to appear professional. "According to my research, we should encounter black bear sign within the first 5 miles, with possible grizzly evidence above 6,000 feet. Tom shouldered his pack with practiced efficiency, but Sarah caught the slight shake of his head at Jake's clinical assessment. "Kid's not wrong about the bears," Tom said quietly to Sarah, "but he's thinking about normal bears. normal behavior patterns. What we've been tracking up there, he trailed off, securing his rifle in its sling. I've never seen anything like it. The trail began gently enough, winding through dense stands of Douglas fir and western hemlock. The forest floor was carpeted with decades of fallen needles, muffling their footsteps to whispers. For the first hour, the only sounds were their measured breathing, the occasional call of a distant bird, and the soft percussion of hiking poles against rock and root. But Sarah began to notice the silence. As a biologist, she was attuned to the complex symphony of forest life, the chittering of squirrels, the rustle of small mammals in the undergrowth, the myriad calls of songbirds. Here, that symphony was muted, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. "Anybody else notice how quiet it is?" Marcus asked, lowering his camera after photographing a particularly ancient cedar. He had been documenting their journey with the methodical precision that had made his wildlife photography internationally recognized, but even he seemed unsettled by the forest's unnatural stillness. Jake paused to examine what looked like claw marks on a nearby tree trunk. "Interesting. These gouges are too high and too wide for black bear. Grizzly, maybe, but the pattern is unusual." He measured the marks with a small ruler, frowning. "Actually, the spacing suggests something significantly larger than even a mature male grizzly." Tom stopped abruptly, causing the rest of the group to nearly collide with him. His dark eyes scanned the forest ahead with the intensity of someone who had survived decades in the wilderness by trusting his instincts. "We're being watched," he said simply. The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She followed Tom's gaze, but saw only the endless columns of trees disappearing into shadow. "Animal or human?" she asked, automatically reaching for the bear spray clipped to her belt. "Neither," Tom replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Both. Something else entirely." They continued in tense silence, climbing steadily as the trail switched back and forth across the mountainside. The trees gradually thinned as they gained elevation, and patches of sky became visible through the canopy. Sarah found herself constantly glancing over her shoulder, unable to shake the feeling of invisible eyes tracking their every movement. At their first rest stop, beside a small alpine lake that reflected the grey sky like a mirror, Jake made a discovery that changed everything. While the others were filtering water and checking their maps, he called out from a muddy section of shoreline where several game trails converged. "Dr. Chen, you need to see this." The track was unlike anything Sarah had encountered in 15 years of field work, roughly bear-shaped, but wrong in every detail. Too large, too deep, with claw marks that extended impossibly far from the pad impressions. The spacing between individual tracks suggested a gait that was neither fully quadrupedal nor bipedal, but something unnaturally fluid between the two. Marcus photographed the track from multiple angles, his camera's rapid-fire clicks the only sound in the oppressive silence. "What kind of bear leaves prints like this?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't be comforting. Tom knelt beside the track, his weathered hands hovering over the impression without quite touching it. "Not a bear," he said finally. "At least not anymore." Sarah felt her scientific skepticism warring with a growing sense of dread. "What do you mean, not anymore?" "The old stories my grandfather told," Tom continued, his voice taking on the cadence of someone reciting oral tradition. "They spoke of a time when the balance was broken, when hunger and rage twisted a creature so far from its nature that it became something else entirely, something that remembered being a bear but had become something worse." Jake scoffed, though the sound came out more nervous than dismissive. "You're talking about Wendigo mythology, psychological folklore designed to explain abnormal predator behavior in times of ecological stress." Tom's eyes flashed. You want to reduce it to psychology, kid? Fine. But tell me this. What kind of psychological stress creates tracks like these? What kind of ecological imbalance produces claw marks that go 6 inches into solid wood? The argument was interrupted by a sound that made them all freeze. A low, guttural rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was almost a growl, but wrong in the same way the tracks were wrong, too deep and too resonant to have come from any throat that had ever drawn natural breath. "We need to move," Tom said, shouldering his pack with sudden urgency. "Now." They hiked in grim silence for the next 3 hours, climbing steadily toward their planned campsite at Granite Lake. The trail became increasingly treacherous as they gained elevation, crossing loose scree slopes and navigating around massive boulders that had tumbled from the peaks above. Sarah found herself constantly alert, scanning the terrain ahead for any sign of movement or disturbance. The weather was deteriorating faster than predicted. What had begun as scattered clouds was developing into an ominous wall of grey-black storm cells rolling in from the west. The wind had picked up, sending loose pine needles spiraling through the air and causing the trees to sway and creak with increasing agitation. "We might want to consider turning back," Marcus suggested during their next break, eyeing the approaching storm with obvious concern. "These clouds look like they mean business, and we're getting pretty exposed up here." Sarah checked her GPS. They were still 2 miles from their intended campsite, and the terrain ahead would only become more challenging. But they had hiked too far and invested too much preparation to turn back now, especially with the strange tracks and behavioral anomalies they were investigating. "We press on," she decided, "but we set up camp as soon as we reach the lake before this storm hits." Jake, who had been uncharacteristically quiet since discovering the massive tracks, suddenly pointed ahead to a stand of aspens whose golden leaves shimmered despite the lack of sunlight. "Look at those trees." At first, Sarah wasn't sure what he was pointing at. Then she saw it. Several of the aspens had been stripped of bark in long parallel gouges that spiraled around their trunks. The wounds were fresh, with sap still bleeding from the damaged wood, but the pattern was unlike anything she had seen in decades of studying bear behavior. "Bears do mark trees," she said slowly, approaching the damaged aspens with scientific curiosity overriding her growing unease. "But not like this. These marks are systematic, almost deliberate." Tom examined the closest tree, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "This wasn't marking territory," he said. "This was practice." "Practice for what?" Marcus asked, though his camera had stopped clicking, as if he was reluctant to document what they were seeing. "For something that's learning to use claws it wasn't born with." The storm hit just as they crested the final ridge before Granite Lake. What began as scattered raindrops quickly intensified into a driving downpour that turned the rocky trail into a treacherous maze of slippery surfaces and hidden hazards. Lightning split the darkening sky with increasing frequency, followed by thunderclaps that echoed off the surrounding peaks like the sounds of some titanic battle. Granite Lake spread before them like a sheet of black glass, its surface churned by the wind and rain into white-capped wavelets that lapped against a shoreline of tumbled boulders and stunted alpine vegetation. The lake was rimmed by towering granite cliffs that rose nearly vertical on 3 sides, creating a natural amphitheater that amplified every sound, including their voices and the storm's fury, into an ominous cacophony. "There!" Tom shouted over the wind, pointing to a relatively sheltered area near the lake's eastern shore, where a cluster of large boulders formed a natural windbreak. "We can set up the tents behind those rocks." They struggled through the storm, their packs growing heavier as they absorbed the driving rain. Sarah's boots slipped on the wet granite, and she barely caught herself from tumbling into the lake's frigid water. By the time they reached the sheltered area Tom had identified, they were all soaked through and shivering. Setting up camp in the storm was a nightmare of tangled guy lines, wind-whipped fabric, and numb fingers that refused to work the tent clips properly. Jake's smaller tent went up first, wedged between two massive boulders that provided some protection from the worst of the wind. Sarah and Marcus shared a larger expedition tent, while Tom preferred his own compact shelter that he could pitch with practiced efficiency even in the worst conditions. As darkness fell and the storm continued to rage, they huddled in their respective shelters, eating cold rations and listening to the wind howl through the granite formations around the lake. Sarah tried to maintain radio contact with the outside world, but the combination of the storm and the surrounding peaks made communication impossible. "How long do storms like this usually last up here?" she asked Tom, when he briefly emerged from his tent to check the anchor points. Tom's headlamp illuminated his weathered face, but his eyes remained shadowed and unreadable. "Depends," he said. "Sometimes they blow through in a few hours, sometimes they settle in for days, but this one..." He paused, listening to the wind's keening wail. "This one feels different, angrier." It was near midnight when Sarah first heard the sound that would haunt her dreams for years to come. She was dozing fitfully in her sleeping bag, lulled by the rhythmic drumming of rain on the tent fly, when something else penetrated the storm's white noise, a deep, resonant breathing that seemed to come from just outside the tent wall. At first, she thought it might be Marcus, but her tentmate was sleeping soundly beside her, his breathing shallow and regular. The sound continued, slow, deliberate inhalations, followed by long, shuddering exhalations that seemed far too large for any normal lung capacity. Sarah lay perfectly still, her heart hammering as she strained to locate the source of the breathing. It seemed to move around the tent's perimeter, pausing at various points as if something were methodically investigating their shelter. When it stopped directly beside her head, separated only by the thin nylon of the tent wall, she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. The breathing continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then, gradually, it faded back into the storm's chorus, leaving Sarah to wonder if she had imagined the entire episode. But when she finally drifted back to sleep, her dreams were filled with images of massive shapes moving through the darkness beyond their fragile shelter. She woke to an unnatural silence. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the morning air crisp and crystalline. Granite Lake reflected the dawn sky like polished obsidian, and the surrounding peaks glowed with alpenglow that painted the granite cliffs in shades of pink and gold. But as Sarah emerged from her tent, she immediately noticed that something was wrong. The area around their campsite was covered with tracks, the same massive wrong-shaped prints they had found at the lower lake. But now they circled their tents in a deliberate pattern that suggested prolonged observation rather than casual investigation. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered, photographing the tracks with professional detachment that didn't quite mask his obvious unease. "Whatever made these spent hours out here last night, just watching us?" Jake emerged from his tent, looking haggard and pale. "Did anybody else hear breathing outside their tent?" he asked. "Really deep, really slow breathing that seemed too big for any normal animal?" Sarah felt her blood run cold, so she hadn't imagined it after all. "You heard it too?" "All night long," Jake confirmed. "It kept moving around, like it was studying us, learning about us." Tom appeared from his tent, already fully dressed and alert despite the early hour. His dark eyes surveyed the tracks with an expression that Sarah had never seen before. Not quite fear, but something deeper and more primal. Recognition, perhaps, of something his ancestors had warned against. "We're leaving," he announced. "Pack everything. We hike out now." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to insist on continuing their research despite the unsettling events of the previous night. But one look at the tracks surrounding their campsite, tracks that formed an almost perfect circle around their tents, as if they had been deliberately penned in, convinced her that Tom's instincts were correct. They broke camp with unprecedented speed, stuffing gear into packs without the usual care for organization or weight distribution. The beautiful morning light couldn't dispel the sense of being observed that had settled over them like a fog, and Sarah found herself constantly glancing at the tree line and rocky outcroppings where something large enough to leave those tracks might be concealed. "There," Marcus said suddenly, pointing across the lake toward the base of the granite cliffs. "Movement in those shadows." Sarah followed his gaze, but saw nothing except the play of morning light on rock and the gentle motion of pine branches in the breeze. But as she watched, something shifted in the deep shadows at the base of the cliff, something too large and too fluid to be explained by natural causes. "I don't see anything," Jake said, but his voice carried a tremor that betrayed his words. "It's there," Tom confirmed, "watching us, waiting to see what we do next." They shouldered their packs and began the long descent toward the trailhead, moving as quickly as the treacherous terrain would allow. Sarah took point, using her GPS to navigate while Tom brought up the rear, his rifle now unslung and ready. The normal sounds of the forest, birdsong, the chatter of small mammals, the rustle of vegetation, remained unnaturally muted, as if every living thing in the area was holding its breath. They had descended perhaps a mile when they encountered the first clear evidence that they were being stalked. At a switchback where the trail crossed a small stream, the muddy banks were covered with fresh tracks, not just the massive prints they had seen before, but also what looked like the impressions of something that had been dragging itself along on its belly, following their scent trail with deliberate persistence. "It's tracking us," Sarah said, kneeling to examine the marks more closely. "Following our exact route from yesterday." Marcus adjusted his camera settings and began documenting the new tracks. "The spacing suggests it's moving much faster than normal bear locomotion would allow. Look at the distance between prints. This thing is covering ground at an incredible rate." Tom studied the surrounding terrain with the eyes of someone who had survived decades in the wilderness by understanding predator behavior. "It's herding us," he said finally, "forcing us to take the main trail instead of any of the alternate routes. Why would it want to keep us on this specific path?" The answer came an hour later when they reached a narrow section of trail that wound along the edge of a steep ravine. Here the path was barely 3 feet wide, with a sheer drop of several hundred feet on one side and an equally steep climb on the other. It was the perfect place for an ambush, with no room to maneuver and no possibility of escape. Sarah was leading when she saw them. More tracks, fresher than any they had encountered, pressed deep into the soft earth of the trail itself. But these weren't the same massive bear-like prints. These were something else entirely, something that looked almost human, except for the size and the unmistakable impression of claws that extended far beyond where fingers should end. "It's learning," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of wind through the ravine. "Whatever this thing is, it's learning to walk upright, to use tools, to think strategically." Jake pressed close behind her, his face pale with fear and scientific fascination warring for control. "That's impossible. Behavioral adaptation doesn't happen that quickly. It takes generations of evolutionary pressure to—" His words were cut off by a sound that made them all freeze, the crack of breaking branches from somewhere above them, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the forest with deliberate stealth. Whatever was up there was trying to remain hidden, but its sheer size made complete concealment impossible. "Move!" Tom hissed. "Slowly! Don't run! But get through this section as fast as you can without losing your footing." They traversed the narrow trail section in single file, each step carefully placed to avoid loose stones or unstable ground that might send them tumbling into the ravine. Sarah's hands were shaking as she gripped her hiking poles, and sweat ran down her back despite the cool mountain air. The sounds from above continued, the deliberate crack of branches, the soft thud of something heavy moving from tree to tree, the occasional scatter of small stones dislodged by massive feet. Whatever was tracking them was keeping pace, staying just out of sight while maintaining its position directly overhead. When they finally reached wider, more stable ground, Sarah allowed herself a moment of relief. But it was short-lived, because carved into the trunk of a massive pine tree that stood beside the trail was a message that chilled her to the bone. The marks were clearly deliberate, not random scratches but purposeful gouges arranged in a pattern that suggested communication. 3 parallel lines, each nearly a foot long, and carved deep enough to expose the pale sapwood beneath the bark. Below them, a series of smaller marks that looked almost like primitive writing, as if something with claws had learned to leave written messages. "What does it mean?" Marcus asked, photographing the carved tree with professional detachment that couldn't quite mask his obvious unease. Tom studied the marks for a long moment, his weathered face grave. "It's counting," he said finally. "Keeping track of something. Or someone." Jake pulled out his field notebook and began sketching the marks with trembling hands. "If this represents some form of communication, it suggests cognitive abilities far beyond normal predator intelligence. We could be dealing with something that's developed rudimentary language skills." "Or something that already had them," Tom replied quietly. They continued their descent in increasingly tense silence, acutely aware that whatever was stalking them had demonstrated not just predatory cunning, but actual intelligence. The trail wound through dense forest now, providing countless opportunities for concealment and ambush. Every shadow could hide a massive form. Every sound could herald an attack. Sarah found herself thinking about the stories Tom's grandfather had told, tales of creatures that were no longer quite animal, but not yet something else entirely. The scientific part of her mind rejected such folklore, but the evidence they were encountering challenged every assumption about natural behavior and evolutionary biology. They were perhaps 3 miles from the trailhead when they encountered the most disturbing sign yet, a small clearing where something had arranged objects in a deliberate pattern. Stones, branches, and what looked like animal bones had been placed in concentric circles around a central area where the earth had been scraped bare and marked with the same claw patterns they had seen on the tree. "It's creating ritual spaces," Sarah breathed, her scientific training finally providing a framework for what they were seeing. Territorial marking behavior, but far more complex than anything documented in natural predator species. This suggests abstract thinking, symbolic communication, even religious or spiritual concepts. Marcus circled the clearing with his camera, documenting the strange arrangement from multiple angles. "Whatever made this has been here recently. Look at how fresh those scratches in the earth are. Some of them are still damp." Tom remained at the edge of the clearing, his rifle ready and his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding forest. "We need to go. Now, this place, it's not meant for us. We're intruding on something that doesn't want to be studied or understood." As if in response to his words, a sound echoed through the forest, not quite a roar, not quite a scream, but something that combined the worst elements of both. It was answered by similar calls from different directions, creating a chorus of inhuman voices that seemed to surround their small party. "There's more than one," Jake whispered, his face pale with terror and fascination. "Multiple individuals with coordinated behavior patterns, pack-hunting strategies adapted to something far more intelligent than normal predators." "Run," Tom said simply. They ran. The final 3 miles to the trailhead became a nightmare of desperate flight through increasingly treacherous terrain. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder and more coordinated. The crash of massive bodies moving through underbrush, the splintering of trees too small to provide adequate concealment, and always those terrible vocalizations that seemed to come from throats that had learned to shape sounds beyond their natural capacity. Sarah's pack bounced painfully against her back as she stumbled over roots and rocks, her lungs burning with the effort of maintaining their desperate pace at altitude. Marcus ran beside her, his expensive camera equipment forgotten in the face of immediate survival, while Jake brought up the rear with the wide-eyed terror of someone experiencing real predation for the first time. Tom led them with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had navigated these mountains for decades, but even his wilderness expertise couldn't completely mask the fear in his movements. Whatever was pursuing them had forced him to acknowledge that his understanding of natural predator behavior was fundamentally inadequate. They burst from the tree line into the parking area, where Tom's pickup truck waited like a monument to civilization and safety. Sarah had never been so grateful to see asphalt and metal in her life, but as they threw their gear into the truck bed and prepared to drive away from the nightmare they had encountered, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were carrying something with them. Not physical evidence, but a knowledge that would change how they saw the world forever. "Did you get photographs of everything?" she asked Marcus as Tom gunned the engine and sent gravel spraying behind them. "Everything I could," he confirmed, clutching his camera bag protectively. "But Sarah, I'm not sure anyone will believe what we documented up there. Hell, I'm not sure I believe it myself." In the back seat, Jake was already scribbling notes in his field journal, his scientific training warring with the terror of what they had experienced. "We need to report this to the wildlife authorities," he said. "If there are creatures up there displaying this level of intelligence and aggression, the public has a right to know." Tom caught Sarah's eye in the rearview mirror. "You report what you want, Dr. Chen, but my advice is to let sleeping dogs lie. Some things are better left undisturbed, and that mountain is one of them." As they drove away from Granite Peak, Sarah found herself staring back at the towering summit through the truck's rear window. The mountain looked peaceful in the afternoon sunlight, its granite cliffs gleaming gold and pink in the clear air. But she knew that somewhere in those shadowed forests, something waited and watched and learned, growing more intelligent and more dangerous with each passing day. The photographs Marcus had taken would eventually be analyzed by experts in wildlife biology, cryptozoology, and behavioral psychology. The tracks they had documented would be measured and compared to known species without finding a match. The claw marks on trees would be studied for patterns that suggested symbolic communication beyond anything previously documented in predator species. But none of the scientific analysis could capture the true horror of their experience, the knowledge that somewhere in the wilderness, evolution had taken a turn that challenged every assumption about the natural order. Something that had once been a bear had become something else entirely. Something that remembered its origins, but had transcended them in ways that made it infinitely more dangerous. Years later, Sarah would wake from dreams filled with the sound of deliberate breathing outside tent walls and the sight of massive shapes moving through forest shadows. She would remember the feeling of being studied by intelligence that was ancient and patient and utterly alien to human understanding. And she would wonder if, somewhere in the mountains, those creatures continued to evolve and learn and prepare for encounters with a world that didn't yet understand what it was facing. The forest kept its secrets, but the secrets were growing restless. Marcus's photographs would become legendary in certain circles, blurry images that showed just enough to raise questions while revealing too little to provide answers. The scientific community would debate their authenticity, while government agencies quietly investigated reports of unusual predator activity in remote wilderness areas. Tom would never guide another expedition into the backcountry around Granite Peak, claiming health problems that prevented him from undertaking strenuous hikes. But late at night, in the small bar where local guides gathered to share stories, he would sometimes speak in whispers about things that watched from the shadows and learned to use intelligence in ways that nature had never intended. Jake would complete his graduate degree with a dissertation on anomalous predator behavior that would be quietly buried in university archives after raising uncomfortable questions about the limits of scientific understanding. He would spend the rest of his career studying conventional wildlife biology, never again venturing into the kind of research that had nearly cost him his sanity on Granite Peak. And Sarah would continue her work as a wildlife biologist, but with a haunted quality that her colleagues would notice without understanding. She would publish papers on predator intelligence and behavioral adaptation, always dancing around the edges of what she had really encountered without ever quite crossing the line into testimony that would destroy her scientific credibility. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of dawn when the world seemed balanced between sleep and waking, she would remember the sound of breathing outside her tent and know that somewhere in the wilderness, something was still watching and waiting and growing more intelligent with each passing day. The mountain kept its secrets, but Sarah Chen would carry them for the rest of her life, a burden of knowledge that was too dangerous to share and too terrible to forget. In the end, perhaps that was the true horror, not the creatures they had encountered, but the knowledge that such things existed in a world that wasn't prepared to acknowledge them. Evolution, it seemed, had not finished its work in the remote places where civilization's light had never quite penetrated the ancient shadows, and in those shadows, something that had once been natural was becoming something else entirely, something that remembered the taste of flesh and the thrill of the hunt, while learning to think and plan and communicate in ways that would have terrified the scientists who studied predator behavior from the safety of their laboratories. The wilderness, it seemed, still held mysteries that mankind was not ready to solve, and some mysteries, perhaps, were better left undisturbed in the shadows, where they had learned to thrive beyond the boundaries of natural law. But nature, as Sarah had learned, was not always natural. Sometimes it was something far more complex and dangerous, something that had learned to adapt in ways that challenged every assumption about the world and humanity's place within it. The mountain remembered, and in remembering, it had become something more than stone and forest. It had become a keeper of secrets that grew more terrible with each passing season. Secrets that would eventually demand acknowledgement from a world that preferred its monsters to remain safely contained within the realm of fiction. Granite Peak stood silent against the sky, beautiful and terrible and patient, waiting for the next group of researchers to venture into its domain and discover what evolution could accomplish when freed from the constraints of scientific expectation. The shadows deepened, and in their depths, something stirred with intelligence both ancient and terrifyingly new. The next stories, December 7th, 2024. Polar bear attacks, Russian oil tanker crew, 3 dead. December 7th, 2024. Polar bear attacks, Russian oil tanker crew, 3 dead. The MV Novgorod lay at anchor 17 nautical miles northeast of Murmansk, her massive hull dark against the pewter waters of the Barents Sea. At 298 meters long and carrying 127,000 tons of crude oil destined for Rotterdam, she represented the pinnacle of Russian maritime engineering. Her double-hulled construction and state-of-the-art navigation systems had earned her the designation as one of the safest vessels in the Rosneft fleet. On this frigid December morning, with temperatures hovering at -23°C and the aurora borealis painting ghostly green curtains across the star-studded sky, Captain Mikhail Volkov stood on the bridge, unaware that his vessel would soon become the scene of one of the most horrific wildlife attacks in maritime history. Captain Volkov, 54 years old with greying temples and weathered hands that spoke of 30 years at sea, had commanded the Novgorod for the past 4 years. Born in Arkhangelsk to a family of fishermen, he had worked his way up through the ranks of the Soviet merchant marine, surviving the collapse of the USSR and the chaotic transition to private shipping companies. His wife, Elena, often worried about his long voyages through the increasingly unpredictable Arctic waters, where climate change had brought new dangers alongside melting ice and shifting weather patterns. Their 2 children, Alexei and Marina, now adults with families of their own, had long since stopped asking when their father would retire. They knew the sea was in his blood, as inescapable as the tide itself. The ship's complement consisted of 23 experienced mariners, each selected for their expertise in Arctic navigation and oil transport. First Officer Dmitry Kozlov, 38 years old, had served under Volkov for 2 years and was being groomed for his own command. A graduate of the Admiral Makarov State University of Maritime and Inland Shipping in St. Petersburg, Kozlov possessed both theoretical knowledge and practical experience that made him invaluable during the treacherous winter runs through ice-prone waters. His methodical approach to safety protocols had earned him the respect of the entire crew, though some of the older hands found his adherence to regulations occasionally excessive. Among the crew members who would soon face unimaginable terror were 3 men whose lives had taken very different paths to bring them aboard the Novgorod. Ivan Petrov, 29 years old, served as the ship's bosun, responsible for deck maintenance and cargo operations. A former paratrooper who had served in Chechnya, Petrov carried the psychological scars of combat but found solace in the structured environment of maritime service. His compact frame belied considerable strength, and his ability to remain calm under pressure had made him popular among his shipmates. He sent most of his earnings home to his elderly parents in Volgograd, where his father suffered from emphysema caused by decades of working in chemical plants. Leonid Markov, 42 years old, worked as the ship's electrician, maintaining the complex systems that kept the Novgorod operational in the harsh Arctic environment. A quiet man with thinning dark hair and intelligent brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, Markov had studied electrical engineering at Moscow Technical University before family financial pressures forced him to abandon his academic pursuits. His expertise with the ship's electrical systems, from navigation equipment to the sophisticated heating systems that kept the crew quarters habitable, made him indispensable. He had been married to his wife Svetlana for 18 years, and they had twin daughters, Katya and Oksana, who were 15 and dreaming of university educations their father was determined to provide. Pavel Sokolov, 35 years old, served as an able seaman and had worked on oil tankers for 12 years. Originally from Siberia, he possessed an intimate understanding of extreme cold weather survival that proved valuable during Arctic voyages. His robust build and cheerful disposition made him a natural leader among the younger crew members, though he harbored private struggles with alcoholism that he had been battling for the past 3 years with varying degrees of success. His ex-wife, Natasha, had taken their son Sergei to live in Moscow, and Sokolov's child support payments motivated him to take the most demanding and highest-paying assignments available. Chief Engineer Yuri Volonsky, 51 years old, oversaw the massive diesel engines that powered the Novgorod through ice-choked waters. A bear of a man with calloused hands and a booming laugh, Volonsky had spent his entire adult life in engine rooms. From nuclear submarines in the Northern Fleet to the merchant vessels that now comprised his domain. His encyclopedic knowledge of marine propulsion systems had saved more than one voyage when mechanical failures threatened to leave ships stranded in hostile waters. His wife had died of cancer 3 years earlier, and his dedication to his work had intensified as a means of coping with his grief. Radio Officer Alexei Kuznetsov, 26 years old, represented the new generation of maritime professionals who combined traditional seamanship with modern technology. A graduate in telecommunications engineering, he managed the ship's sophisticated communication systems that kept the Novgorod in constant contact with Murmansk traffic control and the various maritime authorities throughout their route. His ability to diagnose and repair complex electronic equipment had proven invaluable during previous voyages when Arctic storms damaged sensitive equipment. He lived with his girlfriend Anna in St. Petersburg, and they had been planning their wedding for the following summer. Cook Boris Fedorov, 48 years old, maintained crew morale through his culinary skills, preparing meals that provided both nutrition and comfort during long voyages. A former chef at upscale restaurants in Moscow, he had chosen maritime service for its higher pay and regular schedule, allowing him to support his disabled brother and aging mother. His galley served as an informal gathering place where crew members shared stories and concerns, making him privy to the interpersonal dynamics that could affect ship operations. His ability to prepare elaborate meals using limited ingredients and storage space had earned him a reputation throughout the Russian merchant fleet. Dr. Sergei Romanov, 55 years old, served as the ship's medical officer, a requirement for vessels on extended voyages in remote waters. A former military physician who had served in Afghanistan during the Soviet intervention, he possessed extensive experience in trauma medicine that would prove inadequate for the horrors he would soon witness. His medical bay was equipped to handle routine injuries and illnesses, but nothing in his training had prepared him for treating victims of a large predator attack. He had been considering retirement to spend more time with his grandchildren in Rostov-on-Don. The weather conditions on December 7th were typical for the region during winter, with clear skies that allowed the aurora borealis to display its ethereal beauty across the Arctic night. The temperature had dropped to -23 Celsius, with light winds from the northwest at 8 knots, creating minimal sea state. Visibility was excellent, extending to the horizon where the lights of Murmansk created a faint glow against the darkness. The Barents Sea surrounding the anchored tanker appeared deceptively calm, its surface disturbed only by the gentle swells that caused the massive vessel to roll slightly in her anchorage. The Novgorod had been at anchor for 18 hours, waiting for clearance to enter Murmansk harbor, where longshoremen would begin the process of offloading her cargo. The delay had been caused by ice conditions in the harbor approach, requiring icebreaker assistance that was temporarily unavailable due to mechanical problems with the nuclear icebreaker Yamal. Such delays were routine during winter operations in the Arctic, and the crew had settled into their normal routine of maintenance, watch standing, and rest periods, while they waited for clearance to proceed. The ship's position, logged precisely at 69 degrees, 47 minutes, 12 seconds north, 33 degrees, 15 minutes, 36 seconds east, placed her in waters that had become increasingly frequented by polar bears in recent years. Climate change had disrupted traditional ice patterns, forcing the massive predators to travel greater distances in search of seals, their primary food source. Marine biologists had documented increasing interactions between polar bears and human activities as the animals adapted to changing environmental conditions, though attacks on vessels remained extremely rare. Dr. Marina Volkov, a marine biologist with the Arctic Research Institute in Murmansk, and no relation to the ship's captain, despite sharing his surname, had been studying polar bear migration patterns in the Barents Sea for the past decade. Her research had revealed disturbing trends in bear behavior, including increased aggression and desperate food-seeking behavior as traditional hunting grounds became inaccessible due to reduced sea ice. Her reports, filed with various maritime authorities, had warned of potential human-wildlife conflicts in shipping lanes, but her recommendations for enhanced safety protocols had been largely ignored due to budget constraints and the perceived low probability of encounters. The polar bear that would soon terrorize the crew of the Novgorod was a massive male, estimated by subsequent forensic analysis to weigh approximately 650 kilograms and measure 2.8 meters in length. Born 12 years earlier on the ice floes near Svalbard, he had survived the increasingly difficult conditions that faced his species by developing enhanced swimming abilities and opportunistic feeding behavior. Marine biologists would later theorize that weeks without successful seal hunting had driven him to a state of hyperphagia, an extreme hunger that compelled dangerous risk-taking in search of food. The bear's journey to the waters surrounding the Novgorod had begun 6 days earlier, when he had been driven from a promising hunting area by a larger, more aggressive male. Forced to swim across increasingly large expanses of open water, he had burned precious fat reserves while searching for ice floes substantial enough to support successful seal hunting. His condition had deteriorated steadily, transforming him from a cautious predator into a desperate animal willing to investigate any potential food source, regardless of associated dangers. At 04:30 hours on December 7th, the bear had detected the scent of cooking food carried on the wind from the anchored tanker. The aroma of Boris Fedorov's early morning meal preparation, designed to provide hot breakfast for the crew, had traveled across the water with sufficient intensity to trigger the bear's predatory instincts. From a distance of approximately 3 kilometers, he had begun swimming toward the source of the scent, his powerful limbs propelling him through the frigid water with surprising speed and endurance. The ship's watch rotation placed Third Officer Nikolai Petrov, no relation to Bosun Ivan Petrov, on the bridge during the pre-dawn hours. 28 years old and relatively inexperienced in Arctic operations, he had been distracted by paperwork and had failed to maintain proper visual scanning of the waters surrounding the vessel. The ship's radar, calibrated for detecting other vessels and ice formations, was not configured to identify small objects like swimming animals. The thermal imaging system, capable of detecting the bear's body heat signature, was not actively monitored during routine anchor watches. At 04:45 hours, the bear reached the starboard side of the Novgorod's hull, approximately amidships near the cargo manifold area. The ship's massive size created areas of relative calm water in her lee, allowing the exhausted animal to rest briefly while assessing this unprecedented situation. The bear's acute sense of smell continued to detect food odors, now mixed with the diesel fumes and industrial odors that characterized the working vessel. His primitive brain, driven by starvation, interpreted the ship as a potential source of sustenance rather than a threat to be avoided. The Novgorod's freeboard, the distance from the waterline to the deck level, measured approximately 8 meters when fully loaded with cargo. However, the ship's designers had incorporated several features that would prove catastrophic during the bear's boarding attempt. A series of mooring bits and fair leads created handholds along the hull, while external piping and equipment provided additional climbing opportunities for an animal possessing the bear's strength and determination. At 04:48 hours, the bear began his ascent of the ship's hull, using his powerful claws to grip the steel plating and external fittings. His climbing technique, observed later through security camera footage, demonstrated remarkable problem-solving ability as he selected the most efficient route upward. The sound of his claws scraping against steel was muffled by the ambient noise of the ship's generators and ventilation systems, preventing the watch personnel from detecting his approach. Third Officer Petrov's failure to observe the bear's approach would later become a subject of intense investigation by maritime authorities. The official inquiry would reveal that he had been completing cargo documentation rather than maintaining proper lookout duties, a violation of international maritime safety protocols that contributed to the tragic events that followed. His testimony, given weeks later from his hospital bed where he was recovering from psychological trauma, would provide crucial insights into the sequence of events. The first indication of the bear's presence came at 0452 hours when bosun Ivan Petrov emerged from the crew quarters to begin his routine inspection of deck equipment. A conscientious seaman who took pride in maintaining the ship's external appearance, he had developed the habit of conducting thorough visual inspections during his watch periods, checking for any signs of damage or deterioration that might affect safety or operational efficiency. Ivan Petrov's military background had trained him to remain alert in potentially dangerous situations, but nothing had prepared him for the sight that greeted him as he stepped onto the main deck. The massive polar bear, still dripping seawater from his arduous climb, stood approximately 20 meters away near the port rail, his yellow eyes reflecting the deck lighting as he surveyed his new environment. The animal's size was overwhelming, his shoulder height nearly matching Petrov's own, with massive paws that left wet prints on the steel decking. The bear's behavior during these initial moments, captured by multiple security cameras, would later be analyzed by wildlife experts attempting to understand the psychological factors that drove the attack. Rather than displaying immediate aggression, the animal appeared to be assessing the situation, his head moving slowly as he processed the unfamiliar sights, sounds, and smells of the industrial environment. His posture suggested caution rather than attack mode, indicating that the tragedy might have been avoided if proper wildlife encounter protocols had been implemented. Ivan Petrov's initial reaction demonstrated the combat training that had served him well during his military service. Rather than panicking or making sudden movements that might trigger an aggressive response, he began backing slowly toward the nearest entrance to the ship's superstructure, maintaining visual contact with the bear while reaching for his radio to alert other crew members. His measured response bought precious seconds that would ultimately prove insufficient to prevent the disaster. At 0453 hours, electrician Leonid Markov emerged from a different access point, carrying a toolbox and electrical testing equipment for routine maintenance on the deck lighting systems. His attention focused on the technical tasks ahead. He was unaware of the bear's presence until Ivan Petrov's urgent hand signals alerted him to the danger. Markov's initial reaction was disbelief, his mind struggling to process the impossibility of encountering a polar bear on the deck of an oil tanker. The bear's response to Markov's sudden appearance marked the transition from cautious exploration to predatory behavior. The animal's posture shifted noticeably, his head lowering and shoulders hunching as his instincts categorized the humans as potential prey rather than threats. Wildlife behaviorists would later note that the bear's starvation had eliminated his natural caution around humans, replacing it with desperate hunger that overrode survival instincts. Pavel Sokolov's emergence onto the deck at 0454 hours completed the tragic convergence of circumstances. Having been awakened early by unusual sounds that he couldn't identify, he had decided to investigate rather than dismissing them as typical ship noises. His years of experience had taught him that unexplained sounds often indicated equipment problems that required immediate attention, particularly in Arctic conditions where mechanical failures could have serious consequences. The presence of 3 humans on the deck triggered the polar bear's attack response with devastating swiftness. Wildlife experts would later explain that polar bears, unlike their brown and black cousins, had evolved as pure predators with limited experience of humans. The animal's brain, conditioned by millions of years of evolution to view any moving object as potential prey, initiated the hunting sequence that would transform the Novgorod's deck into a scene of unimaginable horror. The bear's initial charge targeted Ivan Petrov, who was closest to the superstructure entrance and therefore perceived as the most immediate threat to the animal's escape route. The speed of the attack, captured in horrifying detail by the ship's security cameras, demonstrated the explosive acceleration that made polar bears among the most dangerous predators on Earth. Despite his impressive size, the bear covered the distance to Petrov in less than 4 seconds, his powerful limbs propelling him across the steel decking with surprising silence. Petrov's military training proved inadequate against an opponent for which no human preparation existed. His attempt to reach the safety of the superstructure fell short by mere meters, the bear's massive paw striking him between the shoulder blades with enough force to lift him off his feet and send him sprawling across the deck. The impact, estimated by forensic investigators to exceed 1,500 pounds of force, broke several ribs and caused internal injuries that would prove fatal within minutes. The bear's attack on Petrov demonstrated the calculated brutality that characterized polar bear predation. Rather than delivering an immediately fatal bite, the animal used his weight and strength to pin his victim while inflicting wounds designed to prevent escape. His powerful jaws, capable of crushing seal skulls with ease, clamped down on Petrov's shoulder and neck, puncturing major blood vessels while avoiding immediately vital organs. This technique, evolved for hunting seals through breathing holes in ice, proved devastatingly effective against a human victim. Leonid Markov's attempt to assist his shipmate demonstrated the loyalty and courage that characterized the Novgorod's crew. Despite his terror, he advanced toward the bear while shouting and waving his electrical testing equipment, hoping to distract the animal from its attack on Petrov. His actions, recorded by security cameras, showed remarkable bravery in the face of overwhelming odds, though they ultimately sealed his own fate. The bear's response to Markov's intervention revealed the animal's enhanced aggression state. Rather than being deterred by the approaching human, the bear released Petrov and turned his attention to this new threat. Wildlife behaviorists would later note that the bear's failure to flee when confronted by multiple humans indicated an advanced state of desperation that had overridden normal survival instincts. Markov's death was swift, but no less horrific than his shipmates. The bear's charge covered the distance between them in less than 3 seconds, his massive jaws clamping down on Markov's head and crushing his skull with a sound that was captured by the ship's audio recording systems. The forensic analysis would later reveal that death was instantaneous, providing some small comfort to his surviving family members. Pavel Sokolov's final moments demonstrated both the heroism and futility that characterized human responses to apex predator attacks. Rather than fleeing toward safety, he attempted to reach the ship's emergency alarm system, hoping to alert the crew to the danger and summon help for his dying shipmates. His actions, captured by multiple camera angles, showed a man choosing duty over self-preservation, even in the face of certain death. The bear's attack on Sokolov differed from the previous two in its savage intensity. Perhaps driven to increased aggression by the taste of blood, the animal's assault was more vicious, using both claws and teeth to inflict massive trauma across Sokolov's torso and limbs. The attack continued for nearly 30 seconds, during which the bear's predatory instincts were fully engaged, treating the human victim as he would a large seal or walrus. The security camera footage of these attacks would later become crucial evidence in understanding both the sequence of events and the bear's behavioral patterns. The recordings, captured by 8 different cameras positioned around the deck area, provided multiple angles of the tragedy that allowed investigators to create a precise timeline and analyze the factors that contributed to the disaster. The audio portion of the recordings, including the victim's screams and the bear's vocalizations, would prove too disturbing for public release. At 0458 hours, the bear's rampage was interrupted by the arrival of cook Boris Fedorov, who had come to investigate the source of unusual sounds that had penetrated the galley where he was preparing breakfast. His emergence from the galley access door placed him directly in the path of the blood-soaked predator, who was beginning to consume his victims in accordance with normal feeding behavior. Fedorov's survival depended on a combination of luck and the bear's momentary distraction with his feeding. Rather than charging immediately, the animal assessed this new human while continuing to feed on Sokolov's remains. This brief hesitation allowed Fedorov to retreat back through the galley door and secure it behind him, becoming the first crew member to survive direct contact with the bear. The cook's frantic radio calls to the bridge finally alerted the ship's command structure to the unfolding disaster. His barely coherent reports of a polar bear attack initially met with disbelief from Third Officer Petrov, whose failure to maintain proper lookout had prevented early detection of the threat. The confirmation of multiple casualties required several minutes of confused radio exchanges before the full scope of the emergency became apparent. Captain Volkov's response to the emergency demonstrated the leadership qualities that had earned him command of one of Russia's most valuable merchant vessels. Despite his initial disbelief at reports of a polar bear attack, he immediately implemented emergency protocols designed for man-overboard situations, the closest analog to the unprecedented crisis facing his ship. His orders to seal all external access points and account for all personnel probably saved additional lives by preventing other crew members from inadvertently encountering the bear. The bear's behavior during the 30 minutes following his initial attacks revealed the complex psychology of polar bear feeding patterns. Rather than immediately consuming his victims, the animal engaged in territorial marking behavior, depositing scent markers around the deck area to claim his kill site. This behavior, while providing temporary respite for the surviving crew members, also indicated the bear's intention to remain on the vessel rather than returning to the water. Dr. Sergei Romanov's attempts to organize a medical response demonstrated both his professional dedication and the impossibility of providing effective treatment under the circumstances. The ship's medical bay, located deep within the superstructure, was well equipped for treating routine injuries and illnesses, but lacked the resources necessary for treating massive trauma caused by large predator attacks. His requests for immediate helicopter evacuation were denied due to the ongoing threat posed by the bear's presence on deck. First Officer Dmitry Kozlov's coordination of the emergency response revealed the challenges faced by maritime personnel in dealing with wildlife emergencies. Standard shipping protocols provided no guidance for large predator encounters, forcing the crew to improvise responses based on their general emergency training and common sense. His decision to maintain communications with shore authorities while developing plans for removing the bear demonstrated sound crisis management skills. The bear's exploration of the ship's deck areas during the hour following the attacks provided additional terror for the crew members trapped within the superstructure. Security cameras tracked the animal's movements as he investigated various equipment installations, apparently searching for additional food sources or potential den sites. His ability to open unsecured doors and hatches, captured on video, demonstrated the intelligence and problem-solving capabilities that made polar bears such effective predators. Chief Engineer Yuri Volonsky's assessment of options for removing or neutralizing the bear highlighted the limited resources available aboard commercial vessels for dealing with wildlife emergencies. The ship's small arms locker contained only signal flares and emergency equipment insufficient for stopping a large predator. His suggestions for using high-pressure water hoses or steam cleaning equipment as deterrents were rejected due to concerns about driving the bear into areas where crew members might be trapped. Radio officer Alexei Kuznetsov's communications with shore authorities revealed the confusion and disbelief that initially hampered rescue efforts. His precise position reports and detailed descriptions of the situation were met with requests for confirmation from multiple agencies, delaying the deployment of emergency response resources. The unprecedented nature of the emergency exposed gaps in coordination between maritime rescue services and wildlife management authorities. The Murmansk harbor authorities' initial response to the emergency demonstrated the challenges faced by rescue services when confronting unusual situations. Duty Officer Captain First Rank Vladimir Sergeyev, a veteran of 30 years in maritime rescue operations, had never encountered reports of large predator attacks on commercial vessels. His decision to treat the incident as a potential hoax caused a critical delay in mobilizing response resources. Dr. Marina Volkov, the marine biologist, was contacted by authorities at 0630 hours as they sought expert advice on polar bear behavior and removal techniques. Her immediate recognition of the situation's severity led to urgent recommendations for specialized equipment and personnel. But the remote location of the Novgorod complicated rescue efforts. Her warnings about the bear's likely psychological state emphasized the extreme danger faced by anyone attempting to board the vessel. The Russian Coast Guard cutter Murmansk, commanded by Captain Second Rank Igor Petrov, no relation to the deceased bosun, received emergency orders to proceed to the Novgorod's position at maximum speed. The vessel's crew, experienced in Arctic rescue operations, began preparations for what they assumed would be a routine medical evacuation, unaware of the unique challenges they would face upon arrival. Their standard rescue equipment, including medical supplies and evacuation stretchers, would prove inadequate for the situation they encountered. At 0745 hours, the polar bear's behavior shifted from territorial marking to active feeding. As captured by security cameras positioned around the deck area, the disturbing footage showed the animal consuming portions of his victims while periodically pausing to assess his surroundings for potential threats. Wildlife experts later explained that this feeding pattern was consistent with polar bear behavior when consuming large prey, involving periods of feeding alternated with vigilance breaks. The psychological impact on surviving crew members trapped within the superstructure while listening to sounds from the deck began manifesting in various ways. Several crew members experienced panic attacks, while others retreated into catatonic states as their minds struggled to process the unprecedented horror occurring mere meters away. Dr. Romanov's attempts to provide counseling and sedation were hampered by limited psychiatric medications and his own shock at the situation. Captain Volkov's decision to maintain detailed logs of the incident, despite the ongoing emergency, demonstrated his recognition of the legal and investigative implications that would follow. His contemporaneous notes, recorded every 15 minutes throughout the crisis, provided investigators with precise timelines and decision-making rationales that proved crucial during subsequent inquiries. His ability to maintain professional demeanor while dealing with the loss of crew members under his command revealed exceptional leadership under extreme stress. The Bear's investigation of the ship's external equipment areas brought him into contact with various mechanical systems that could have provided means of escape or accident. His interaction with the ship's boat davits and lifeboat equipment, recorded by security cameras, showed the animal's curiosity about unfamiliar objects combined with frustrated attempts to access enclosed spaces where food odors might be detected. At 0830 hours, the Russian Coast Guard cutter Murmansk arrived at the Novgorod's position, her crew immediately recognizing the gravity of the situation when they observed the massive polar bear on the tanker's deck through binoculars. Captain Petrov's radio communications with the Novgorod's bridge provided the first external confirmation of the emergency, validating the seemingly impossible reports that had been dismissed by some shore authorities. The Coast Guard crew's preparation for boarding operations required careful consideration of tactics and equipment necessary for dealing with a large predator. Master Sergeant Alexei Morozov, the cutter's senior enlisted man and an experienced hunter, assumed responsibility for developing plans to neutralize the bear using the limited weapons available aboard the rescue vessel. His assessment of the situation emphasized the extreme danger posed by attempting to board the tanker while the bear remained active. Dr. Viktor Zaslavsky, a wildlife veterinarian with the Murmansk Zoo, was contacted by authorities seeking expertise in polar bear tranquilization and removal. His immediate response that tranquilizing equipment was not readily available for field use highlighted another gap in emergency response capabilities. His warnings about the unpredictability of tranquilized polar bears, particularly those in aggressive states, influenced decisions about rescue tactics. The bear's reaction to the Coast Guard cutter's arrival demonstrated his awareness of the new threat, while revealing his commitment to defending his kill site. Security cameras captured his movement to positions offering better views of the approaching vessel, his posture indicating alertness without immediate flight responses. Wildlife experts would later note that this behavior suggested the bear's extreme hunger had overcome normal fear responses to human activity. At 09:15 hours, a second rescue vessel, the icebreaker Admiral Lazarev, received orders to proceed to the scene after reports indicated that standard Coast Guard resources might prove insufficient. The icebreaker's crew included personnel with experience in Arctic wildlife encounters, though none had faced polar bear attacks on commercial vessels. Their additional heavy equipment and larger crew complement provided enhanced capabilities for complex rescue operations. The Novgorod's crew, now imprisoned within their own vessel by the presence of the polar bear, began experiencing the psychological effects of prolonged stress and confinement. Several crew members reported auditory hallucinations, hearing voices of their dead shipmates calling from the deck areas. Dr. Romanov's medical logs documented increasing incidents of hyperventilation, panic attacks, and dissociative episodes among the survivors. Chief Engineer Volonsky's monitoring of the ship's systems revealed potential complications arising from the extended emergency. The vessel's position-keeping systems required periodic adjustment to maintain proper anchorage, but accessing the necessary controls would require venturing onto deck areas controlled by the bear. His concerns about engine cooling system maintenance highlighted the possibility that mechanical failures could compound the crisis. The bear's feeding behavior, observed through security cameras, provided disturbing insights into polar bear predation patterns that would later influence Arctic safety protocols. The animal's methodical consumption of soft tissues while avoiding harder structural elements demonstrated feeding strategies evolved for marine mammal prey. The footage, deemed too graphic for public release, became valuable research material for wildlife behaviorists studying predator psychology. At 10:00 hours, the arrival of a helicopter from the Northern Fleet Air Wing provided additional rescue capabilities, though the pilot's initial assessment indicated that landing on the Novgorod's deck was impossible, while the bear remained active. Senior Lieutenant Pavel Volkov, the helicopter commander and coincidentally sharing the same surname as the ship's captain, coordinated with surface vessels to develop alternative rescue strategies. The helicopter crew's aerial observations provided the first comprehensive view of the deck situation, confirming the deaths of 3 crew members and documenting the bear's control of critical areas of the vessel. Their reconnaissance flights, maintained at sufficient altitude to avoid disturbing the bear, provided tactical intelligence necessary for planning ground operations while serving as psychological support for the trapped crew members who could see help hovering overhead. Dr. Marina Volkov's arrival aboard the Admiral Lazarev at 10:30 hours brought essential expertise to the rescue operation, though her assessment of the situation confirmed the worst fears of rescue commanders. Her evaluation of the bear's behavior patterns, based on video evidence transmitted from the Novgorod, indicated an animal in an advanced state of hyperphagia unlikely to retreat voluntarily from his kill site. The marine biologist's recommendations for dealing with the bear emphasized the extreme danger posed by attempts at non-lethal removal methods. Her warnings about polar bear unpredictability, particularly when defending food sources, influenced tactical decisions that prioritized crew safety over animal welfare considerations. Her expertise proved invaluable in predicting the bear's likely responses to various intervention strategies. At 11:15 hours, Master Sergeant Morozov's boarding party from the Coast Guard cutter began preparations for armed intervention, recognizing that non-lethal methods were unlikely to succeed given the bear's psychological state. The tactical team, equipped with military-grade rifles and specialized ammunition, developed approaches designed to minimize risks to surviving crew members while ensuring effective neutralization of the threat. The boarding party's approach to the Novgorod required careful coordination to avoid alerting the bear to their presence until they were in position to engage effectively. Their use of the ship's accommodation ladder, positioned on the side opposite to the bear's location, allowed them to reach the superstructure without immediate detection. The tactical movement, captured by helicopter-mounted cameras, demonstrated professional competence under extraordinary circumstances. The bear's discovery of the boarding party at 11:27 hours marked the beginning of the final confrontation between human rescuers and the apex predator. Security cameras captured the animal's immediate assessment of this new threat, his posture shifting to full aggressive mode as he prepared to defend his territory against the armed intruders. His vocalizations, recorded by multiple audio systems, demonstrated the territorial aggression that made polar bears among the most dangerous animals on Earth. Master Sergeant Morozov's engagement of the bear required 3 precisely placed shots from his 7.62 millimeter rifle to neutralize the threat effectively. The first shot, aimed at the animal's center mass, caused the bear to charge directly toward the boarding party, covering nearly 20 meters in less than 4 seconds, despite his mortal wound. The second and third shots, fired at point-blank range, finally stopped the animal mere meters from the tactical team. The bear's death throes, lasting nearly 2 minutes, provided a final demonstration of the incredible vitality that characterized apex predators. His continued attempts to attack, even while mortally wounded, illustrated the determination that had brought him to the ship's deck and sustained him through the prolonged confrontation. Security cameras captured his final moments, which would later provide closure for the families of his victims, while contributing to scientific understanding of polar bear physiology. The boarding party's immediate medical assessment of the 3 victims confirmed what had been apparent from aerial reconnaissance. All 3 crew members had died from their wounds, with massive trauma indicating the overwhelming force that polar bears could bring to bear against human prey. The scene on the deck, described in official reports as resembling a battlefield, provided stark evidence of the predator's efficiency. Dr. Romanov's examination of the victims, conducted once the deck was secured, provided official confirmation of the causes of death while documenting the extent of injuries inflicted by the polar bear. His medical reports, filed with both maritime and legal authorities, became crucial evidence in subsequent investigations, while providing families with definitive information about their loved ones' final moments. The evacuation of surviving crew members began at 1200 hours, with helicopter transfers to medical facilities in Murmansk for evaluation and treatment. The psychological trauma experienced by the survivors would require months of intensive therapy, with several crew members never returning to sea duty. Their first-hand accounts of the attack provided investigators with crucial insights into the sequence of events and the bear's behavior patterns. Captain Volkov's debriefing with maritime authorities revealed the systemic failures that had contributed to the tragedy, from inadequate wildlife encounter protocols to insufficient training in Arctic predator awareness. His recommendations for enhanced safety measures, based on his experience during the crisis, would influence future shipping regulations in polar bear habitats. The removal of the deceased crew members and the polar bear's carcass required specialized equipment and procedures, with forensic preservation necessary for subsequent investigations. The bear's remains, weighing 647 kilograms according to official measurements, were transported to research facilities where necropsy examination would provide insights into the animal's condition and behavior. The forensic examination of the polar bear revealed the desperation that had driven his attack on the Novgorod. His body condition indicated prolonged starvation, with fat reserves depleted to levels that would normally prove fatal within days. Stomach contents analysis revealed no food intake for at least a week prior to the attack, explaining the extreme aggression that had overcome normal caution around humans. The investigation into the incident, conducted jointly by maritime authorities and wildlife officials, revealed multiple contributing factors that had created the conditions for tragedy. Climate change impacts on Arctic ice conditions had displaced traditional polar bear hunting grounds, forcing animals into increasingly desperate searches for food sources. The Novgorod's position in traditional polar bear habitat during a period of ice scarcity had created an intersection of human activity and wildlife desperation. The official report, released 6 months after the incident, made numerous recommendations for preventing similar tragedies in the future. Enhanced wildlife monitoring systems, improved crew training in predator encounter protocols, and modified shipping routes during critical periods were among the measures proposed to reduce human-wildlife conflicts in Arctic waters. The families of Ivan Petrov, Leonid Markov, and Pavel Sokolov filed wrongful death lawsuits against the shipping company, alleging inadequate safety protocols and insufficient training for Arctic wildlife encounters. The legal proceedings, lasting nearly 2 years, resulted in substantial settlements while establishing precedents for maritime safety in polar bear habitats. The psychological impact on surviving crew members manifested in various forms of post-traumatic stress disorder, with several requiring extended medical leave and career changes. Dr. Romanov's own struggle with survivor guilt led to his early retirement from maritime service, though he continued providing counseling services to other mariners who had experienced traumatic incidents. The security camera footage of the attack became the subject of intense legal and ethical debates regarding its use in investigations versus privacy concerns for victims' families. The recordings, classified as evidence in multiple proceedings, were never released publicly, but provided crucial insights for wildlife behaviorists studying polar bear predation patterns. The incident prompted reviews of Arctic shipping safety protocols by international maritime organizations, leading to enhanced requirements for wildlife encounter training and emergency response procedures. The International Maritime Organization developed new guidelines for vessels operating in polar bear habitats, incorporating lessons learned from the Novgorod tragedy. Climate scientists pointed to the incident as evidence of the broader impacts of Arctic warming on wildlife behavior, with polar bears increasingly driven to desperate measures as traditional hunting grounds disappeared. The attack became a case study in human-wildlife conflict resolution, highlighting the need for adaptive management strategies in changing Arctic environments. The crew of the Admiral Lazarev, who had participated in the rescue operation, were awarded commendations for their professional response under extraordinary circumstances. Master Sergeant Morozov received the Order of Courage for his role in neutralizing the polar bear threat, though he reportedly struggled with the necessity of killing the desperate animal. The Novgorod herself returned to service after extensive cleaning and psychological counseling for replacement crew members, though several experienced mariners refused assignments aboard the vessel. The ship's reputation within the Russian merchant fleet was permanently affected, with some crew members considering her cursed or unlucky. Memorial services for the 3 victims were held in their respective home cities, attended by maritime officials and representatives of the polar bear research community. The ceremonies honored both their service to their country and their tragic role in highlighting the growing conflicts between human activity and wildlife survival in a changing Arctic. The scientific value of the incident data led to enhanced research into polar bear behavior and human-wildlife conflict resolution. Dr. Marina Volkov's subsequent studies, funded partly by settlements from the legal proceedings, contributed to improved understanding of predator psychology and desperation behaviors in starving animals. The media coverage of the incident, while initially sensationalized, evolved into thoughtful examination of Arctic environmental changes and their impact on both human activities and wildlife survival. Documentary productions and scientific publications use the case study to illustrate the complex challenges facing Arctic communities and industries. The long-term psychological impacts on the Novgorod surviving crew members provided insights into maritime trauma recovery, with several participating in research studies designed to improve treatment protocols for similar incidents. Their experiences contributed to enhanced mental health support systems for mariners experiencing traumatic events. The incident's influence on Arctic shipping insurance rates reflected the growing recognition of wildlife encounter risks in polar regions. Insurance companies began requiring enhanced safety protocols and wildlife awareness training as conditions for coverage, raising operating costs for Arctic shipping operations. The polar bear's story, reconstructed through forensic analysis and environmental monitoring data, became emblematic of the broader struggle facing Arctic wildlife as climate change disrupted traditional ecosystems. His desperate swim to the Novgorod and subsequent attack illustrated the lengths to which starving predators might go in search of survival. The technical analysis of the ship's security systems revealed both strengths and weaknesses in maritime surveillance capabilities. While cameras had captured detailed footage of the incident, the lack of real-time monitoring and automated threat detection systems had prevented early warning of the bear's approach. The rescue operations coordination between multiple agencies highlighted both successful inter-agency cooperation and areas requiring improvement in Arctic emergency response. The lessons learned influenced training programs and equipment procurement for future maritime rescue operations in polar bear habitats. The environmental impact assessment conducted after the incident revealed the complex ecological factors that had contributed to the bear's presence near the shipping lane. Changes in ice distribution, seal population dynamics, and ocean temperature patterns had created conditions that brought desperate wildlife into conflict with human maritime activities. The crew training programs developed in response to the incident incorporated realistic scenarios and psychological preparation for wildlife encounters, recognizing that technical knowledge alone was insufficient for managing crisis situations involving apex predators. The training emphasized both practical response techniques and mental preparation for extraordinary circumstances. The international shipping industry's response to the incident included enhanced communication systems for reporting wildlife sightings and coordinated information sharing about animal behavior patterns in Arctic waters. These improvements aimed to provide early warning systems that could prevent similar tragedies through route modifications and enhanced vigilance. The legal precedents established by the wrongful death lawsuits influenced maritime law regarding employer responsibilities for crew safety in unusual circumstances. The cases clarified obligations for providing adequate training and safety equipment when operating in environments with known wildlife risks. The memorial established at the Murmansk Maritime Academy honored the 3 victims while serving as an educational reminder of the risks faced by mariners in Arctic waters, The memorial included educational displays about polar bear behavior and human-wildlife conflict prevention, serving both commemorative and educational purposes. The incident's documentation in maritime safety databases provided a reference point for future emergency planning and crew training programs. The detailed timeline and behavioral analysis offered valuable insights for developing more effective response protocols for similar situations. The environmental monitoring systems enhanced after the incident included improved tracking of polar bear movements and feeding patterns, allowing for better prediction of areas where human-wildlife conflicts might occur. These systems provided early warning capabilities for shipping companies and maritime authorities. The psychological support systems developed for maritime crews following traumatic incidents drew heavily on lessons learned from the Novgorod survivors' experiences. The programs addressed both immediate crisis intervention and long-term recovery support, recognizing the complex nature of maritime trauma. The research publications resulting from the incident analysis contributed to the scientific understanding of apex predator behavior under extreme stress conditions. The data provided insights into the decision-making processes that drove the polar bear to attempt such an unprecedented attack on a large vessel. The shipping industry's enhanced safety protocols included improved communication systems between vessels and shore authorities, enabling more rapid response to emergency situations. The protocols emphasized early detection and prevention rather than reactive measures after incidents had begun. The victim advocacy programs established by maritime unions in response to the incident provided enhanced support for families of crew members killed or injured in unusual circumstances. These programs recognized that traditional maritime insurance and compensation systems were inadequate for extraordinary situations. The Arctic Research Initiatives, funded partly through legal settlements from the case, contributed to improved understanding of climate change impacts on polar bear behavior and human-wildlife interactions. The research provided scientific basis for policy decisions regarding Arctic shipping routes and seasonal restrictions. The incident's influence on international maritime safety regulations included enhanced requirements for emergency equipment and training when operating in polar bear habitats. The regulations recognized that traditional maritime safety protocols were insufficient for addressing apex predator encounters. The long-term environmental monitoring programs established after the incident tracked changes in polar bear populations and behavior patterns, providing early warning systems for identifying areas of increased human-wildlife conflict risk. The monitoring contributed to adaptive management strategies for Arctic shipping operations. The crew memorial services evolved into annual remembrance ceremonies that honored all maritime personnel lost in unusual circumstances, while promoting awareness of the evolving risks faced by seafarers in changing Arctic environments. The ceremonies served both commemorative and educational purposes for the maritime community. The incident's documentation in emergency response training programs provided realistic scenarios for preparing rescue personnel to handle extraordinary wildlife encounters. The training emphasized both tactical response techniques and psychological preparation for managing complex emergency situations involving multiple casualties and ongoing threats. As years passed, the tragedy of December 7th, 2024 remained embedded in the collective memory of the maritime community as a stark reminder of the unpredictable dangers that could emerge from the intersection of human activity and desperate wildlife. The three men who lost their lives aboard the Novgorod became symbols of both the courage displayed by merchant mariners and the need for enhanced understanding of the changing Arctic environment. The polar bear, transformed from a magnificent apex predator into a desperate killer by circumstances beyond his control, represented the broader tragedy facing Arctic wildlife as climate change disrupted ecosystems that had remained stable for millennia. His story, preserved in forensic reports and security camera footage, served as a powerful illustration of the unintended consequences of environmental change. The incident's legacy extended far beyond the immediate tragedy, influencing maritime safety protocols, wildlife conservation strategies, and Arctic shipping policies for years to come. The lessons learned from that horrific December morning continued to shape how humans approached activities in polar bear habitats, recognizing that the changing Arctic environment required new approaches to coexistence between human industry and wildlife survival. The families of Ivan Petrov, Leonid Markov, and Pavel Sokolov found some measure of comfort in knowing that their loved ones' sacrifice had contributed to enhanced safety measures that would protect future generations of mariners. Their deaths, while tragic beyond measure, had illuminated dangers that few had previously recognized and prompted changes that would prevent similar tragedies. The surviving crew members of the Novgorod, scattered now across various occupations and locations, carried with them the psychological scars of that December morning, while also bearing witness to the resilience of the human spirit under extraordinary circumstances. Their survival stories provided hope and inspiration to others facing traumatic experiences, demonstrating that recovery was possible even from the most horrific encounters. The scientific understanding gained from the incident continued to inform research into human-wildlife interactions, predator behavior under extreme stress, and the psychological impacts of climate change on Arctic species. The data collected during those terrifying hours provided insights that would influence conservation strategies and conflict prevention measures for decades to come. The maritime industry's enhanced safety culture, prompted partly by the Novgorod incident, represented a positive outcome from the tragedy. The improved training, equipment, and protocols developed in response to the attack would protect countless mariners from similar fates, honoring the memory of those who died by preventing future casualties. The Arctic environment itself continued to change, with polar bear populations facing increasing challenges as ice-dependent ecosystems evolved in response to warming temperatures. The incident served as an early warning of the types of human-wildlife conflicts that could be expected as desperate animals were forced into increasingly risky behaviors in search of survival. The memorial services held annually on December 7th brought together maritime communities, wildlife researchers, and policymakers to remember the victims while recommitting to the safety measures and environmental protection efforts inspired by their sacrifice. These gatherings served as powerful reminders that human activities in the Arctic carried responsibilities to both crew safety and wildlife conservation. The documentation of the incident in maritime safety databases, legal precedents, and scientific literature ensured that the lessons learned would be preserved for future generations. The detailed records provided a comprehensive case study that would inform decision-making processes whenever similar situations threatened to develop. The incident's influence on popular culture, while handled sensitively to respect the victim's memory, helped raise public awareness of Arctic environmental issues and the challenges facing both maritime workers and polar wildlife. Educational programs and documentary productions used the case study to illustrate complex environmental and safety concepts for broader audiences. The ongoing research into polar bear behavior, climate change impacts, and human-wildlife conflict resolution continued to build upon the foundation provided by the tragic events aboard the Novgorod. The scientific community's commitment to understanding and preventing similar incidents honored the memory of the victims while working to protect both human lives and wildlife populations. The story of December 7th, 2024, remained unfinished, its implications continuing to unfold as Arctic conditions evolved and human activities in polar regions expanded. The tragedy served as both a warning and an inspiration, demonstrating the need for constant vigilance while highlighting the courage and dedication of those who worked in Earth's most challenging environments. The three men who died that December morning, Ivan Petrov, Leonid Markov, and Pavel Sokolov, were remembered not just as victims of an unprecedented tragedy, but as mariners who had dedicated their lives to supporting their families and serving their country through one of the world's most demanding professions. Their sacrifice illuminated dangers that few had imagined, while inspiring changes that would protect future generations of Arctic workers. The polar bear, too, was remembered as more than just a killer, but as a magnificent predator driven to desperation by forces beyond his control. His story served as a powerful symbol of the unintended consequences facing Arctic wildlife, as climate change disrupted ancient patterns of survival, forcing animals into increasingly desperate measures that brought them into fatal conflict with human activities. As the Arctic continued to warm and shipping routes expanded through previously icebound waters, the lessons of the Novgorod incident remained urgently relevant. The enhanced safety protocols, improved training programs, and increased environmental awareness that emerged from the tragedy represented a commitment to preventing similar disasters while respecting both human safety and wildlife conservation needs. The incident's documentation in official reports, scientific publications, and memorial records ensured that future generations would understand both the immediate tragedy and its broader implications for Arctic operations. The comprehensive analysis of events, contributing factors, and lessons learned provided a foundation for continued improvement in safety protocols and environmental protection measures. The families of the victims, while never fully recovering from their loss, found meaning in the positive changes that emerged from the tragedy. The enhanced safety measures, improved training programs, and increased awareness of Arctic environmental issues represented a living memorial to their loved ones, ensuring that their sacrifice continued to protect others long after the immediate grief had been processed. The maritime community's response to the incident demonstrated both the close bonds that connected seafarers worldwide and their commitment to learning from tragic experiences. The willingness to examine failures honestly and implement necessary changes reflected the professional culture that enabled safe operation in some of Earth's most challenging environments. The scientific community's continued research into the factors that contributed to the incident provided hope that similar tragedies could be prevented through better understanding of wildlife behavior, environmental change, and human-wildlife interaction patterns. The commitment to ongoing research honored the memory of the victims while working to protect both future mariners and Arctic wildlife populations. The incident's legacy in Arctic shipping safety represented a transformation in how the maritime industry approached operations in polar bear habitats. The enhanced protocols, improved equipment, and increased training requirements that emerged from the tragedy created a new standard of safety that would protect countless mariners in the years to come. The story of December 7th, 2024 would be retold in training sessions, safety briefings, and educational programs for decades to come, serving as both a warning and an inspiration. The courage displayed by the victims and survivors, the dedication of the rescue personnel, and the commitment to learning from tragedy represented the best of human nature, even in the face of unimaginable horror. The polar bear's desperate swim to the Novgorod and his subsequent attack would be remembered as a powerful illustration of the lengths to which starving predators might go in search of survival. His story served as a reminder that human activities in Arctic environments carried responsibilities to understand and respect the needs of wildlife populations struggling to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. As the years passed and new challenges emerged in Arctic shipping and wildlife conservation, the lessons of the Novgorod incident continued to inform decision-making processes and policy development. The comprehensive documentation of events, causes, and consequences provided a reference point for addressing similar challenges while honoring the memory of those who had died. The incident's place in maritime history was secured not just by its unprecedented nature, but by the positive changes it had inspired in safety protocols, training programs, and environmental awareness. The tragedy had been transformed into a force for prevention, ensuring that the deaths of Ivan Petrov, Leonid Markov, and Pavel Sokolov would continue to protect lives long into the future. The story of December 7th, 2024, remained a powerful reminder that the intersection of human activity and wildlife survival in the changing Arctic environment required constant vigilance, enhanced understanding, and unwavering commitment to both crew safety and environmental protection. The tragedy had illuminated previously unrecognized dangers, while inspiring the changes necessary to address them effectively. In the end, the legacy of that horrific December morning transcended the immediate tragedy, becoming a catalyst for enhanced safety measures, improved environmental awareness, and deeper understanding of human responsibilities in Arctic environments. The 3 men who died aboard the Novgorod and the desperate polar bear who killed them had become symbols of both the challenges facing Arctic operations and the commitment to addressing those challenges through enhanced knowledge, improved protocols, and unwavering dedication to preventing similar tragedies in the future.